I'm sorry if I look a bit like a snowman. It is 3 o'clock in the morning here. It is a bit cold. I've actually just woken up about half an hour ago. I've had a very short time to prepare for this episode. But I did. But let me just greet you guys. Just first of all, Stephanie, sorry if you've been waiting longer than everyone else. I actually told Stephanie I'd be up 15 minutes ago, so sorry if that was a bit of a inconvenience. Real Batman, good to see you. Paddy, good to see you. Amy, and who else is here? Is that it? Okay, well, maybe a few more will join a little bit later. Yeah, where is Nisi? So I must tell you that probably next week's, not even next week's, Sunday's episode and next week, Wednesday's episode, will probably be earlier or later, because I'm trying to push my sleep further into the day. I've kind of been trying to produce content during America's day, so my night. But I've kind of needed just to, in order to get back to exercising in the day, I've kind of needed to adjust that now. So it probably won't be this time because I'll probably be sleeping like a normal person in this country. Timmy, do you want to say hello? I'm pleased to say in terms of my rib that I swam a kilometer yesterday with tumble turns and so on, felt like, let's say 99% fine, like no problems. And I'll probably get on my mountain bike for the first time in about 7 or 8 weeks later today. Obviously take it easy, don't go too fast, and just, but I do need to get it done. I am a little bit nervous because of the last time I was on my bike and everything, but we'll see how it goes. Amy Hall, Bridget, good to see you. I wonder where Nisi is. So I don't know whether we're going to get to the Borinage. I looked at some of the letters, and where we are right now is sort of the summer of 1876, and he doesn't write that many letters over. Let me just go to that exact part. So in 1876, there's 2 letters in June, 3 letters in July, 2 letters in August, and so on. And then the next year, it's fairly busy. But then 1878, it's like 1 letter a month. So not a lot. And then 1879, like in the whole year, there's something like 4 letters or something. Well, not a lot of letters. And then 1880, it's almost like nothing, just a couple of letters. So I am thinking we are going to be able to race through time simply because there are not a lot of letters that take us from Ramsgate to the Borinage 2 years later in 1878. And it's actually quite amazing. He spends, from what I understand, 3 years in the Borinage, which is a very grim coal mining area. I don't know if you can trump the horrible conditions of a coal mine in terms of a job. Like if you had to say, what's the worst possible job you could work in? Maybe it's like a lavatory cleaner or something. But in a coal mine, you are underground. You've got coal dust in your lungs. You're in the dark. It's dirty. but it's basically your full day is spent underground, and it's hot, and you don't get a lot of money either. So, and so he spends 3 years basically in those conditions, also for minimum pay. In any event, that is where we want to get to in this live stream. We want to get to the Borinage. Let me share the link. So I am going to share the link. Don't worry, I will share the link. So this is from Web Exhibits. And then this is also from this is also quite a good source. Okay, I see there's 19 of you in chat. Let's maybe give it a couple more minutes, maybe say 3 more minutes. So a couple of things to mention. One of them is I'm probably going to do a live tomorrow on Casey White and Vicky White. I kind of want to talk about an aspect I haven't spoken about much, but just my impression of what attracted him to her and what attracted her to him. And I think it's very, very different. I think the depth of commitment between the two is also very different. And certain other things that have come out into the news. I don't know if you know, they actually did a 40-minute trial run where for 40 minutes they were both out of the jail and wanted to see what would happen, kind of thing. So that's quite interesting. But I kind of more want to, I also saw a comment that just flabbergasted me. Someone said, Vicky didn't mind dying. And it's again, we seem to be again in that whole mythos of, is it murder or did she commit suicide? Did somebody shoot her or did she commit suicide? I don't know what you guys think, but it's kind of the same thing with Van Gogh again. So you've got to ask again, was she suicidal? Although I think it's a bit of a different way of looking at that. It's because the circumstances of her death were fraught. So that whole narrative of was she suicidal, I think, is a little bit different because one's got to look at the context in the moment that she died, right? One's got to look at that as well. Stephanie says, I think her choices weren't great. Absolutely. Absolutely. Stephanie says, I'm transcribing the Ask Me Anything while I wait. Okay. So I'm either going to be doing Vicky White tomorrow or something with Stephanie with CrimeCon. If Stephanie finishes it, the Ask Me Anything, she says it's a lot of work, then we'll do that. If she doesn't, then we'll do the sort of Vicky White thing. Yeah. So we'll see. Amy says, I would love to hear Nick's perspective on this case. Thanks a lot. It is interesting that she called 911 and, was it to arrange a negotiator? What is that all about? Definitely puts things in a different light. Amy says, thanks, Stephanie, for your hard work. Okay, so I think we're going to get going with the first letter. And this is really, I think, a bunch of letters from the Van Gogh family to Theo talking about Vincent at this time. Remember in the previous episode we dealt with Ramsgate. He goes to Ramsgate and he's sort of seems to be interested in the surroundings. Finds the sea invigorating, and he describes it quite often, but you still get a sense he's not terribly happy there. So he's left his work as the art dealer, and he's now kind of oscillating, to use Amber Heard's word, oscillating, trying to find a place where he fits, where he's a round peg in a round hole. Right now he isn't. So we're really going to go through 2 years now, from Ramsgate to the Borinage. And so you've got to ask, what changes even more in him now? Remember, he's kind of had this religious epiphany. He's had the sense of, I want to care for the poor, or something like that. He's in this Dickensian place where he sees he wants to push aside his privilege, and he wants to live amongst simple folk, and he sees them as God's children, right? That's really wants to be. But between 1876 and 1878, he goes even further down that spiral, and ultimately ends up at the Borinage. And you've got to think that this horrifies his family. It's like, what is Vincent doing, right? And so that's what we're going to kind of go through now. And that whole idea of what is Vincent doing, what is going on, what is he thinking, is actually captured in the very first line of this letter from Reverend Van Gogh, that's Vincent's father, to his brother, right? Written on 12 January 1876. So at this point, Vincent's actually just been fired and is in Paris, but these letters are just quickly going through what his family are saying. So he writes, Vincent's problems keep giving us great concern. On the 4th of this month, he wrote that he had a very unpleasant encounter with Monsieur Boussard at the moment of the New Year's wishes. He had been especially blamed for going home at the end of the year. He certainly should not have done it, but he appears to have stubbornly stuck to his point. After this encounter, there's no other way open to him, he feels, than to say that he will leave the 1st of April. So that's really one of the reasons why he got fired. Was he was supposed to work over Christmas, I guess, and he just went home. It's kind of understandable, but also, not. Then this is a letter from Liz, that's another of their sisters, to Theo, written in February 1876. These are not the full letters, just the references to Vincent in them. How nice for you to be allowed to make the trade journey for the spring season. I'm sure that'll be a big change for you. So just that. Then Reverend Van Gogh to Theo, 8 March 1876. It is just as I wrote to you. It is certain that Wilhelmine is not going to stay in England. From Reverend Van Gogh to Theo, 15 March 1876. Anna suggests that she will come home with Wilhelmine in the beginning of May and stay with us until August. Up to that time, she's willing to remain Wilhelmine's governess. And then this is from Mother, Vincent van Gogh's mother. And now, dear Theo, live happily. Look for the good things in life in all respects. Avoid what is not good. Control yourself in the things which you don't need, but were recommended to you in well-meant advice. In March, from Reverend Van Gogh, I find it a marvelous thing for you and hope that it will be successful. You are going to visit some interesting towns. On the 1st of July, so we're now reaching the same time period that the Van Gogh letters kick off in. Reverend Van Gogh to Theo, 1st of July, 1876. If he really has such a love for the church, so this is Van Gogh's father talking about his eldest son to his younger brother. If he really has such a love of the church or the evangelization and is really serious about it, I would think that he could start the study for it in this country. In other words, he can come home and he can study to be a pastor. So that's obviously something like 1 or 2 months after arriving in Ramsgate, it's like he's decided he wants to be a pastor. So that's the next stage, right? Then he says, his father says, but at least 8 years would be needed. So Vincent's 23 years old and he's going to need to study 8 years to become a pastor. That's almost like a doctor. And he says, we might try to find the necessary resources. So his father's, you can kind of tell there's a bit of a sighing resignation. It's like, my son's work isn't working out, and so I guess we're going to have to try and help him become a pastor, and that's going to be 8 more years that we've got to support him, blah, blah, blah. And then he says, on the other hand, it might be better if he tried to find over there or in this country, perhaps better in this country, some position as bookkeeper or as assistant in an office or shop. They're trying to think about, so if you really want to become a pastor or a preacher, you need to find some way of looking after you. We can't sort of look after you. We can't look after everything, kind of thing. Then Reverend Van Gogh goes on to say, if he wants to teach, then he should start the study to be an assistant schoolmaster and try to improve himself later by his own exercise and study of languages. So you kind of get the sense that there's this conflict, this uncertainty. I think I want to be a teacher, maybe I should be a pastor. He's trying to find what he needs to do. Faticus, good to see you here. Thanks for joining us. He goes on to say, alas, we begin to become more and more worried about him. Of course, the lack of finances is also a problem. He doesn't want us to send him anything, but this morning I enclosed 25 guilders in my letter to him. So already you have the situation that Van Gogh is becoming somewhat enigmatic. He is struggling, but he's also saying, I don't want money. It's like he wants to be poor. He wants to be, I guess, one of God's children, right? And so think about this as a 23-year-old and this whole argument about Van Gogh didn't want to be a burden to his brother. And, because he was struggling so much, he took his own life. Absolutely ludicrous, because he has this whole psychology of kind of being a martyr in a way, he's attracted to this Dickensian idea of being poor and going without, and the whole gritty yet poor and charming existence. I mentioned in the previous episode that he made friends with the mouse. He even mentions it in a letter. And it's something that you think about in some of those really old cartoons, The Rescuers, Heidi in the house in Paris as well. Just that strange place where a poor, they say poor as a church mouse, where a poor little mouse nevertheless has a meaningful life within the strictures and structures of human society. You know what I mean? By the way, Ivy, I always know Ivy has caught something when I just hear her bell jingling constantly, because it means she's actually playing with her prey, which really aggravates me. And I think it should aggravate me, because my work is all about the protection of life and the holding the predators of the human world accountable. And yeah, you've got this cat who gets fed her meals, enjoying her animal instincts, and she is an animal. But I don't really like her playing with her prey, because you can imagine if you, that little creature, and that's what I imagine in true crime. What did the victim go through here? And so I don't really want unnecessary suffering if I can possibly prevent it. And so anyway, I heard this jingling, and so sure enough, it was a mouse, and it was a very small little mouse. It was obviously a teenager, I guess, in mouse terms. I think she may have caught its mother or father, but it was possibly part of a family. And this little mouse was now caught, and she was sort of letting it go and then catching it again, letting it go, catching it again. And I was sort of torn between let the cat sort of have her fun and just being like, okay, this is just not, this is not on. Anyway, I'll maybe tell you the end of that story when we're finished with this. So Vincent's address, this is according to his father, is care of W.P. Stokes, that's the headmaster in Ramsgate. W.P. Stokes, Esquire, Linksfield House, Isleworth, and that's near London. Then here's a letter from Liz to Theo, 18 August 1876. This is actually going ahead of our timeline slightly. How much worry that boy gives father and mother. Looking at them, one could not fail to notice it. It is a pity he doesn't have a little more energy. He becomes dull with piety, I believe. Faticus, thanks a lot. So, yeah, you have his siblings complaining about the stress that Vincent's parents and their parents are dealing with because of his, you can call it bad luck or just the route that his life is taking. And I think what she means when she says he becomes dull with piety is that he's becoming stupid with his religious, how can I put it, the religious direction he's going in. His sister describes that's making him stupid in her mind. She doesn't like the decisions he's making as a result of this piousness that he's going into. Then Reverend Van Gogh, and bear in mind, their father is a pastor, so it's quite a thing to say. Then Reverend Van Gogh to Theo, 8 September 1876. Just now a letter from Vincent. We have not yet been able to read it completely due to the wriggly handwriting. I find that really funny. If you think about it, his letters are obviously legible, otherwise they wouldn't have been transcribed. But so yeah, his writing's quite untidy, and one gets the feeling: is he excited? Is he not writing often, and that's causing his handwriting to become untidy? Is his thinking itself kind of untidy? What's going on? Then they say, but in any case, it is not a letter that gives us pleasure, alas. If only he learned to remain simple as a child and would not always go on filling his letter with Bible texts in such an exaggerated and overwrought manner. So you kind of have a sense, understandably, that his parents are baffled, they upset, they are not happy with their eldest son. They like complaining, they're saying, if only he just remained simple as a child and didn't get so intense and exaggerated and overwrought. And obviously that is who their son is. He's an intense man. He was an intense young man, and he was an intense older man. He's an exaggerated person, and I think that's also quite important to bear in mind. I mean, his letters aren't really necessarily full of exaggeration. I wouldn't say they're full of drama, but they are certainly descriptive and so on. I think intense is maybe a better way to think of it, but I think if you could travel back in time and you could have an encounter. Thanks a lot, Real Batman. Thanks for that. 511. If you could have an encounter with Vincent van Gogh, like in the fabric of reality, let's say in 1876, you would probably find him very intense, but possibly also over in a way that you actually find annoying. He only wants to talk about that. He talks a lot, or he doesn't talk at all. Do you know what I mean? So you might be fascinated and be like, wow, this guy is really incredible. Or you might be like, this is a bit much. Can't we just have a friendly conversation? Can't we make some small talk? And he actually has written letters saying I think Adeline Revue said this, that he got irritated with small talk. And so you've got to think for yourself. Are you someone who needs that small talk to sort of make sure the conversation flows? Well, then he would get impatient with you. He would want to talk about intense, deep subjects all the time. And that's often not everyone's cup of tea. Anyway, so they say they're getting tired of his letters filled with Bible texts. And now bear in mind, he's writing to his father, who's a pastor, and they're getting tired of his Bible texts. It's quite ironic. And they say, it makes us worry more and more, and I fear that he becomes altogether unfit for practical life. And I think that was totally warranted. I mean, isn't that ultimately what happened? He ends up in an asylum. He ends up not successful as a person, and what are the parameters of success? I'm talking in a very general sense. What would their parameters for success be? Well, basically respectability, having a job, having a home, I guess, being married, being a father, being a family man, his family getting along with their family and their family getting along with the other siblings, but basically just being a kind of quote unquote normal person, a dude with a job, a dude with an income, a dude with a wife and kids and a home and all of that. And I'm going to say, I'm not saying that's my standard. I'm saying that is a standard. I'm not married. I don't have kids, and I've got a very unconventional job. When people ask me what I do for a living now, I feel like I'm not quite sure what the answer is, because until not that long ago, I was a full-time author, literally full-time, writing 24/7. Well, not 24/7, let's say 14/7, but like writing all the time, day, lots of nights, month after month, year after year. And now it's like, am I a YouTuber? Is that who I am? I mean, that's what I do for a living, but it's just quite a weird thing. But I'm just saying, we have different standards for what is proper, what is respectable, what is acceptable. Anyway, so they say it is bitterly disappointing. How are his letters to you? Obviously, that's a reference to Theo. If he wants to become an evangelist, he should be ready to start the preparation and necessary studies. I would then have more confidence. So they're kind of expressing doubt in what all of this feverish energy. And they basically, the word preparation is emphasized. In other words, they're saying, if he wants to become an evangelist, you must start preparing, you must start studying, you must start doing something. And that's emphasized, preparation, and then studies, that's also emphasized. They're basically saying, okay, if you start doing something practical, then I'll have a bit more confidence in this latest, sort of what seems like a lark, in this latest phase that you seem to be going through. And then the second last letter from a family member, we're just dealing with those before we get to Vincent. And then to Theo, 12 October 1876, on Theo's illness, so Theo's been ill. I've been very worried, but Father had written that the crisis is over. Reverend Van Gogh to Theo, 19 October 1876, let us be grateful that so far you're getting somewhat better, and let us thank God who has spared your life. So it seems like Theo got really sick in 1876, in the sort of spring of 1876. And now we commence with Van Gogh's letters. Letter from Vincent van Gogh to Theo van Gogh, Ramsgate, 17 June 1876. Dear Theo, on Monday last I travelled from Ramsgate to London. That is quite a stroll. So let me be explicit here. Van Gogh walked from Ramsgate to London. Let me just give you the exact distance. I don't want to. Just want to give you the exact distance that would be. You're not going to believe it, but the distance from Ramsgate to London is 77 miles and 77.7 miles, and that is if you're walking distance, and that would take 25 to 26 hours. So if you walk continuously, it would take more than a full day, and probably would have taken him 2 days, 2 full days walking. So if you want to look at it on Google Maps, you can try this link. And that again gives you a sense that we're dealing with an extraordinary person here. He's probably completely happy walking because he doesn't want to have money, and he doesn't want to, he wants to live this simple experience of life, right? So he and if you say that he's full of drama and exaggeration, he says that is quite a stroll. It's actually kind of quite a euphemism. Anyway, now he's going to describe that. He says, the moment that I started on my way, it became very hot, and the same heat waited for me on my arrival at Canterbury. That evening, I pushed on a little bit too long. Finally, I halted in a place where there were many beech trees. That's beech, B-E-E-C-H, and some elms at the edge of a pond. There I rested for a while. The following morning at 3:30, when the birds started singing to salute the first light of dawn, I started off again. That was a good walk! Exclamation mark. So he's really enjoying himself. And so you've got this weird dichotomy where his family are really worried, his family are really troubled, and I think rightly. Meanwhile, he's pretty happy. He's enjoying his freedom in a way. He's enjoying his, he's sort of in a kind of a counterculture event where he's sort of moving against the tide of his culture and of society, and he's enjoying it. He's loving it. He says, at midday, I had made Chatham, where one can see in the distance, in the middle of partial floodings of low-lying meadows, the Thames where the boats go. I thought the weather was always grey in these parts. So I've also lived in the area of the Thames, a place called Maidenhead. I've cycled along the Thames, and there definitely are areas of astonishing beauty, and sort of this beautiful Arcadia where you have this river winding its way through the countryside, and you have these incredible gardens and villages and estates and forests, and they're little pieces. And I mean, I was there in 1999, around there, 1997, 1998, 1999. And it was still lovely, more than 100 years after Van Gogh was there. So there is something about a river that is moving through the countryside, but a somewhat developed countryside, a sort of, you've got some farm animals, you've got some village infrastructure, and a river moving through that, and the boats on the river, and the fishing on the river, and the couples on their boats. It gives it a very tranquil, almost it almost gives you that sense of what heaven might be like. This very peaceful, soothing, calm way that people are going about their day. And if you think about it, this was something he encountered here. He would encounter it again in Auvers-sur-Oise. Auvers-sur-Oise is also the fabric of a little village that is spun around the river Oise. And it does give a certain liveliness and a certain scintillating liveliness that a village just anywhere doesn't quite have. And not only did Orvesuas have this river, but it also has the hill, the ridge line, which gives it the complete palette that you really want. In other words, not just flat land and a river. There is flat land, there is not mountains, but hillsides, and then forests and so on. All of that gives you the sense of the full experience of a landscape. So if you're a landscape artist, you're going to love that. You're going to love the variety of the landscape in a small area. And also the way that how a human settlement interrogates that landscape. Where are farms? Where are barns? Where are homesteads? How does the landscape change where human beings settle, and how do humans change the landscape? What is that dynamic? How do people interact in this setting? All those kind of things. And that is something a painter is very preoccupied with and very interested in. So he's now taking these long walks through the countryside. He says there's been some partial flooding, which has made things quite interesting. He says, it was there that I met a cart, which took me a few miles further, but then the driver went into an inn, and as I supposed I would have to wait a long time, I continued on my way. So even though he gets a little bit of a rest, a cart comes along and he, I guess, thumbs a ride kind of thing. When the cart stops, and even though it's going to carry on, he's like, I don't actually have time for that. I'm going to keep walking, even though it's this really, really long distance of like 77 miles. Yeah, he did basically hitchhike. So then he says, I arrived at the fall of night in the familiar suburbs of London, and I wound my way through the town by long, long roads. I stayed 2 days in London. I walked many times from one place to another in the city to make certain visits, particularly to a pastor to whom I had already written. So if you think about it, kind of the reason he's walked 2 days, 77 miles, is to visit a pastor. That's kind of the point of his journey. He says he's been writing to this pastor. He says, I've enclosed a copy of this letter. I sent it to you to let you know that I started to write with a sentiment of, Father, I'm not worthy, and Father, have pity on me. So you can see he's kind of really he's really taking, this does seem quite exaggerated. This does seem quite dramatic, but you can kind of see where he's coming from. He's trying to throw away his privilege, and he's trying to seize this Dickensian approach of, I'm not worthy and I want to be poor and I want to help the poor. But he's like being really serious. He's really serious in his effort to find a new role for himself, And he's also adopting this humility, which you could say is faux humility. Thanks a lot, Sunflowers. You could say it's faux humility, but you could also say he's trying to find his way to something, and he's not quite sure how, but nevertheless, he's trying to do that. You know what I mean? It's almost like faking it to make it. But he's nevertheless oscillating, I guess. He says, I started to write with the sentiment of, I'm not worthy. And that's something that he's read about that fascinates him, and he finds it admirable, and he finds it like the best. He finds it something that inspires him. He thinks it's great to be self-sacrificing, and it is. But certainly at that time he thought, that's what I want to do. I want to be this sort of self-sacrificing hero. And so you've got to ask yourself, did that whole mentality of being a self-sacrificing hero, didn't that manifest ultimately in his art, where he was like, I'm making art, no one wants to buy it, but I'm kind of a self-sacrificing hero. My art does mean something, no one realizes it, but there it is. You know what I mean? And one's also got to think about that in the context of him losing his ear and the end game of his life. Was he a self-sacrificing hero and that meant he cut off his ear, or did someone cut off his ear and then he became a self-sacrificing hero who takes that upon himself? He doesn't blame someone else for cutting off his ear, he takes that upon himself. The same with maybe getting shot, he becomes a self-sacrificing hero. Because that's something that is like a high value for him, right? Just a little aside, when I was in England in 1997, I think I'd not been there for very long. And I had a pen friend that meant a lot to me, and we had quite a good friendship writing letters, and she eventually went to study in, was it Cambridge, and studied to become a doctor of zoology in Cambridge. And so when I arrived in England, I went to visit her, and I suppose I was doing it to impress her. Instead of just going to her by train, I cycled to her from Maidenhead. So now I was doing the Van Gogh equivalent of not taking conventional transport. And just in my mind, I sort of imagined England to be quite small. And so I was going to cycle from Maidenhead, London, which is on the west side of London, to Cambridge. And I can't remember if it was Oxford or Cambridge. Could actually have been Oxford. Anyway, Timmy, can you get off? I just went on and on and on, and I was riding for hours and hours, and eventually I realized it's really, really far away. And it just shows you I wasn't very in the real world myself. I mean, you'd imagine you look at a map and, you know, and anyway, in the end, I got onto a train. There was no way I could actually get there, so I couldn't get a train across. I had to go from where I was into London to change at King's Cross and then go up to where I needed to go. And I think I only got there like 2:00 in the afternoon, and I remember that quite clearly. But that was my effort to cycle quite a long distance, and I ultimately didn't get there. Van Gogh took 2 days. I gave myself half a day, and it wasn't really enough. Then he goes on to say, if I find work, it will tend towards a position between clergyman and missionary in the suburbs of London, mainly to the working class population. So that is really his intent. That is what he's talking about. In the summer of 1876, that is how it has progressed from being a teacher, which is something he does for basically 1 or 2 months. Now he's decided, I want to be a clergyman in London. That's what he's decided. I'll just put that statement here. Did I not send off that link? That's why it's too long. The link's too long. Okay. So I've just put what he said there just to bear in mind. He's now wanting to be a clergyman in the suburbs of London. Bridget says self-sacrificing is not what is cracked up to be, a deep feeling of unworthiness underlying. People often use you and certainly don't respect you. What they respect is money, beauty, and power. Real Batman says, imitate until you originate. Corporal Deb says, I ran a couple of half marathons in my army days. Yeah, Stephanie says, wow, joined through letters, then cycled to her. I must tell you that she later actually was voted, I think, she won some sort of award, but it was like associated with beauty and intelligence. It was something like Revlon's Unforgettable Woman or something. She won some quite a prestigious award in the UK. And when we met, I was quite a hot triathlete, and but it was a little bit, it felt a little bit, don't laugh when I say this because it's going to seem very arrogant, but it's a little bit like Amber Heard and Johnny Depp, just in the sense of I was in England with my girlfriend, and I'm not quite sure, I think she'd just come out of a relationship, but she was already in another one. But it was almost like, for her, it seemed a little bit like, let's get together. I'm not going to see you, so let's sort of do something. And I was like, I really like you, but no. You know what I mean? So I did really like her, and we did really have great conversations. And I'll never forget when I was sort of resisting what was going on a little bit, she said to me, I think we also went to the Tate Gallery on another day, and my girlfriend then actually joined us. And then she said something to me like, it'll all end in tears. And I don't know how she knew that, but it did. My relationship with my girlfriend ended really horribly, and although I was faithful to my girlfriend wasn't faithful to me, and it did end in real tears, definitely from my side. So I do think about that as one of the encounters that I gave up, in a way, something that meant a lot to me, but it is, just a little bit of an aside there. Okay, so let's keep going. Don't breathe a word to anyone about this new idea, Theo. My salary at Mr. Stokes is probably very small, just enough for room and board, then a few hours of freedom to give particular lessons. If there is no free time to spare, I earn all in all £8 a year. I continue with my story. I stayed one night with Mr. Reed, the following night with Mr. Gladwell. I wonder whether Mr. Gladwell is related to Gladwell from Paris, his co-worker, because he goes on to say, they showed great gentleness towards me. Mr. Gladwell kissed me goodnight that evening and did me good. May it be given to me in the future to prove my friendship for his son now and then. Oh, so it is him. So that's quite a sweet moment in a way, although it's kind of not creepy, but it's kind of bizarre. This father of a former roommate kisses him goodnight, almost as a kind of a blessing, I guess. I don't know. Anyway, he says, I wanted to go on to Welwyn that very evening, but they kept me back literally by force because of the pouring rain. So you can tell how he's enjoying this thing where he shows how the weather doesn't affect him. And so other people have got to, it's almost like they're trying to save him from himself. They've got to, they've got to make sure that he doesn't, anyway, they've kind of got to look after him. And maybe that's what he wants. Maybe he wants to be looked after. Then it says, however, when it began to let up a little about 4 o'clock in the morning, I set off for Welwyn. First, a long walk from one end of the city to the other, about 10 miles. It's 20 minutes walking each mile, which is quite slow. I arrived at 5 o'clock. I suppose if you're walking really long distance, then that's not a bad pace. He says, I arrived at 5 o'clock in the afternoon at our sister's house. I was happy to see her. She looks well, and her room was as Good Friday, Christ in the Garden of Olives, Mater Dolorosa, etc. Not framed, but surrounded by ivy, surely very pleasing. So even his sister's got a picture of Christ in the Garden of Olives in her room. My boy, you will think on reading my letter to the pastor, he is not so bad, he's good, but I'm sure he is. Whatever he may be, think of him once in a while. A firm handshake from your loving brother, Vincent. Do you guys want me to read the letter that he writes to the pastor in London? Do you guys want me to read that? It's the letter that he writes to the guy who he visits in London, that he walked 77 miles to see. Bridget says, hang on, your girlfriend and this girl you fancied went to the Tate. Yeah, so I think what happened was me and this girl that I knew went to the Tate because my girlfriend was working, and then my girlfriend joined us when she finished working. And I remember quite well when she arrived, because we waited quite a long time for her to arrive. When she arrived, we were in like a park setting, and I had the back of my head on this girl's stomach, like almost as a pillow. And I think when she arrived, she was quite shocked I didn't. But I have to say, I did really like her, and I think she knew that and saw that. And I think my girlfriend felt quite insecure because this girl that I liked, we'd written to each other for 10 years already. We knew each other really well. I'd actually introduced her my girlfriend went to England before I did, and I said to her, when my girlfriend was struggling, I said, go and look her up, and she can maybe help you out. And then, so she met my girlfriend actually before I met her in terms of this girl. And then, so the fact that she was in Oxford or Cambridge and very well spoken, very well educated, very beautiful also, my girlfriend felt very threatened by it. And it was like, although nothing technically happened, my girlfriend was like basically treated it as though I had cheated on her, and it was not very nice kind of thing. That was sort of held like a sword of Damocles over me kind of thing. Do I stay in touch? We did communicate a little bit here and there, but not like once every 3-4 years kind of thing. Okay, so let's go on a little bit. So this is his letter to the pastor in England. Reverend Sir, a clergyman's son who, because he has to work for his living, has neither the time nor the money to keep up studies at King's College, and is in any case already a few years older than is usual for those who go there, and has not yet even started the preliminary studies in Latin and Greek, would, all this notwithstanding, be very glad to find a position connected with the church, albeit the position of a university-educated clergyman is beyond his reach. So this is pretty verbose. It's a totally different tone to his other letters. His opening sentence just is really, really long. But he starts it off saying that he's a clergyman's son and he's looking for a position. Then next paragraph, my father is a clergyman in a village in Holland. I went to school when I was 11. My father is a clergyman in a village in Holland. I went to school when I was 11, staying on until I was 16. I then had to choose a profession and did not know which to choose. Through the kind offices of one of my uncles, a partner in the firm of Goupil and Key, art dealers and publishers of engravings, I obtained a position in his business in The Hague. I was employed in this business for 3 years. From there, I went to London to learn English, and after 2 years, moved on to Paris. Various circumstances have, however, compelled me to leave Goupil and Key, and for the past 2 months, I have been teaching at Mr. Stokes' school in Ramsgate. So if you add it all together, he worked for Goupil for around about 5 to 6 years. Then he says, but since my aim is a position in connection with the church, I must look elsewhere. Although I have not been trained for the church, perhaps my past experience of travels, of living in different countries, of associations with various people, poor and rich, religious and irreligious, of work of various kinds, days of manual labor followed by days of office work, etc., perhaps also my abilities to speak various languages may in part make up for my not having been to a university. But the reason I would much sooner give for commending myself to you is my innate love of the church and everything to do with the church, which may lie dormant from time to time, but always reawakens. And if I may say so, although with a great sense of great inadequacy and imperfection, the love of God and of man. So he's saying, even though I'm inadequate and not perfect, I've got a great love for God and of man. He says, and also when I think of my past life and of my father's house in the village in Holland, a sense of, Father, I have sinned against heaven and before thee, and am no more worthy to be called thy son. Make me as one of thy hired servants. Be merciful to me, a sinner. When I lived in London, I often attended your church and have not forgotten you. Now I would ask for your recommendation as I look for a position, and also that you keep your fatherly eye on me, should I find such a position. I have been left a good deal to myself, and believe your fatherly eye will do me good, now that the early dew of the morning has passed away at noon. Thank you in anticipation for what you may feel able to do for me. So quite an incredible letter, very eloquently written at 23 years old. I would have started it with, when I lived in London, I often attended your church. I would have started it by establishing not necessarily a relationship, but a connection between himself and the guy he's writing to. I would have started it with that paragraph and then spoken a bit about his father. In fact, I would have probably ended it with a bit about his father. And then spoken about his personal feelings towards the church and so on. Anyway, that's how I would have done it. I doubt whether I could have done much better than this at 23 years of age. Probably a letter that he wrote over and over again, rewrote, agonized over, possibly even asked for the input of certain people around him. Anyway, now we go to letter from Anna to Theo from Welwyn, that's in England, 17th of June, 1876. Dear Theo, you can well imagine how delightful it was meeting Vincent again. I'm so glad he's meeting all of them here too, for no one can imagine what a happy life I lead here, surrounded by so much love. It will be extremely hard to say goodbye to them all. Perhaps I shall stay here until Christmas. So Anna's having a great time. Anna has just been visited by a brother and she's pretty happy. I just want to go back to something in his letter that is really important. At one point in his letter, he says, I've been left a good deal to myself, which is another way of saying I've been by myself, I'm lonely, I'm alone. Maybe not lonely, I'm alone. He says, I've been left a good deal to myself. So he's alone a lot of the time, right? And this is what he's preoccupying himself with during his alone time, right? Now, if you apply that to me, if you say, what have I done with my alone time? It's literally when in my 40s, I was in a relationship and then we ultimately broke up. And I sort of realized, or I felt quite alone. And I thought, what can I do with all this time? And that's when I wrote this book, Bloodline. Right. It's one of the longest books I've written. It's actually, how long is it? 540 pages, right? It's quite a thick book. And that really, writing Bloodline really set the stage for this incredibly prolific period when I wrote true crime books. So it's the same kind of thing, you know, on the one hand, you can say you alone, and so that propels you into a certain area. But in another way, you could almost look at it with cynicism and even critically and say, when you had this opportunity, when you had this free time, when you had this blank canvas, what did you fill it up with? What did you choose? You could have filled it up with anything. What did you choose to fill your canvas up with? And I guess the answer is true crime. But also, when I went into true crime, I wasn't really interested in true crime, but I was I wanted to bring a human, what's the word? A social consciousness to true crime, meaning it's not just gratuitously being interested in something that happened, but actually looking at what does that say about us? What does it say about society? How does that actually help us negotiate and interrogate the science of man, right? What does it say on a much, much bigger, almost philosophical level? And I found that interesting. I didn't really find the pure narrow confines of a high profile case. I didn't find that interesting or satisfying, but I thought once you expand it to a greater sort of human canvas, then there is a conversation to be had. When you're talking about not just the motive of this person, but human motivations, not just the motive or the intentions of this person in this scenario, but more generalized intentions during our current culture and the zeitgeist, that definitely gives it a more important, it becomes a more important conversation. And I've always felt you need to bring it back to yourself. I don't necessarily mean me, but I mean the reader needs to be brought back to the reader. The reader needs to be made relevant in the story because it's resonating with the reader for some reason. So you need to touch on that and expand on that and make this resonance explicit to the reader, for the reader. And as soon as you do that, you open up all of these dimensions that are really, really interesting, all of these corridors. And that is how you can write 14 books about one case, which I've done. Well, I haven't written 14 books, but I've certainly written 5 or 6 books about numerous different cases, because there are all of these dimensions to explore. And when you build analogy upon analogy, then it gets even richer. So, that's the long answer to what I did when I found myself alone in a way, and what I'm going to do with that. So what does she say here? She says, the situation you write about is not what I'm looking for. I shall probably stay in England for a while now. And now, goodbye. I do hope to see you this summer. How lovely that vacation time is drawing so near. Vincent is busy showing engravings to the children. With much love, yours, Anna. So it seems like she writes this letter while Vincent's actually there on the 17th of June. Okay, so here is another sketch. Houses in Isleworth. See if I can share it with you guys. Okay, so what are you guys saying? Thanks, Real Batman. Okay. I must check Bloodline out. Do me a favor. Well, I don't think you'll actually be able to buy this anymore. This is actually printed by a US publisher. But there is the Kindle version that was the original version. And I actually I need to finish Treachery on Patreon so that I can go onto other things. And one of them that I want to do is start going through Bloodline, and then give you the backstory to some of what goes on there, because that's something that this book has probably meant a lot, the most to me writing it. It came at a great personal cost writing this book. In fact, this book basically took 20 years to write, if you can believe that. I wrote it for 2 years while I was in high school, lost it, and then resurrected it when I was 40 years old, about 20 years later. So the book obviously came out, and then it sat in my heart, having already been written, and then I rewrote it. And obviously, when I rewrote it, I wrote it as a writer that had already written lots of magazine articles compared to just a kid who'd written a couple of essays in high school. But the point is, this book basically was written before any of the others, and this is fiction. But you'll notice that there's sort of true crime elements in it and all that kind of thing. I've actually thought of rewriting this book again, which would be the third rewrite, with the benefit of 100 books having been written if subsequent to it, but essentially before the next edition. And then, how well can you write a fiction epic? Can you write a masterpiece having written so much? And then, who knows, make it into a movie or whatever. Just a thought that I've had. Another possibility is that you just edit it and improve it, and then you write the next book in the series, kind of thing. Just some thoughts that I've had. Nisi, good to see you. Nisi says, I starred my book in my new TCRS notebook. That's good. Started, okay. Oh, really? Are you writing a book, Nisi? That's good to hear. Corporal Deb says, bit like Stephen King. Okay. Nisi, what's your book called? Stephanie says, I wonder how big the sketches are. Small since sent through the mail. Yeah, probably quite small. Okay. Nisi, everyone's wanting to know what the name is of your book. Nisi says, Living Through Rheumatoid Arthritis. Oh, shame. Okay. The original title for this book was Versatile Flying Secrets, if you can imagine that. It actually has got had quite a few different titles. So the first one was Versatile Flying Secrets. And then the second one was The Version. It was just called The Version. And then I think another title was something like Ulysses 2051. That was another title. And so the current title is Bloodline Murmurs of Earth. Maybe that title also needs to change. But yeah, so maybe that's something I can share with you guys on Patreon, and who knows, maybe it'll be reborn differently with your input. Who knows? We'll see. Anyway, let's get back to Van Gogh. So this letter is written from Isleworth, 5th July, 1876. Dear Theo, the time may come when I shall look back with a certain melancholy on the flesh spots of Egypt connected with other situations, that is, the bigger salaries and the higher worldly esteem. This I foresee. Now, if you just look at the words that he uses here, he talks about foreseeing certain things and higher world esteem. I know when I was in my 20s and even earlier, I also got very caught up in writing and art and whatever, more writing. And but I mean, I was drawing myself. I was also kind of into art. But you sort of tend to become quite flowery. You like big words, and that's part of the I guess pageantry of youth, but also it's part of that feeling of trying to not assume, but trying to get into a place of authority and significance before you've actually even earned it. So I think it happens with a lot of young writers. You borrow strength from these big words, but I think it's an essential phase to go through, because your vocabulary improves because you want to know what these big words are, and so it's good to have them in your quiver. But obviously, you need to be colloquial in order to be understood and for your words to flow, right? Not only in a narrative sense, but just in a general sense. So you see some of that coming through with Vincent here. This contradiction between him wanting to be the simple fellow amongst the poor, and then this very flowery language that occasionally comes out, especially that you see to the pastor, right? Then he says there is, and it almost seems like he's a different person in a letter to the pastor. He seems very formal. He seems very put together there, and that's obviously done on purpose. He's trying to find himself. There are different sides to himself that he's exploring. So it's just part and parcel of being a young person trying to find your way. Then he says, there's indeed plenty of bread in the houses that I shall enter if I continue along the road which I have taken, but there's not plenty of money. It's quite an interesting way of putting it. There's plenty of bread in the houses, but not plenty of money. And yet I see a light in the distance so clearly. If that light disappears now and then, it is generally my own fault. I've got to say, when I read those words, I see a light in the distance so clearly, it makes me think of The Great Gatsby, the green light on the other end of the sound, and that light being representative of hope, but also to some extent delusion. He says, if that light disappears now and then, it is generally my own fault. It is very doubtful whether I shall make great progress in this profession, whether the 6 years spent in the house of Gupil and Key, during which time I ought to have prepared myself for this profession, will not always remain an insuperable obstacle. So I'm not even sure I know what that word means. I think it kind of means insurmountable, but let's just have a look. Insuperable. Insuperable. Insurmountable, unconquerable, invincible, unassailable, overwhelming. But I've never, I wouldn't say never, but I've very seldom seen that word. So for him to be using it is kind of interesting, quite kind of odd. Stephanie's just shared a link to my notebook. Thanks a lot for that. I'm just going to see if I can find a link to Bloodline. It's the first book in the series. I really want to redo the covers of some of the others. They need a lot of work. The covers, not necessarily the text. The first cover is not too bad. So just for those interested, here is Bloodline Murmurs of Earth. It's basically book 1 of 5, if you're interested. Bear in mind it's fiction, if that's your cup of tea. Okay, so he says, however, I think I cannot now draw back in any way, even if a part of me should wish to. And then he also emphasizes later on, at present, this is not the case. So he's saying, he's admitting that maybe later on he might have second thoughts, he may have doubts, but he's saying, I've got strong convictions right now. I'm pretty clear what I want to do. Then he says, lately it has seemed to me that there are no professions in the world other than those of schoolmaster and clergyman, which with all that lies between these two, such as missionary, especially a London missionary, etc. I think it must be a peculiar profession to be a London missionary. One has to go around among the laborers and the poor to preach the Bible. And as soon as one has some experience, talk with them, find foreigners who are looking for work or other persons who are in difficulties and try and help them. So I don't know what you guys think, but when I look at this, I kind of think Van Gogh's not a very social guy, right? He's not the life and soul of the party. You know what I mean? He's never had thousands of friends. He's always actually been kind of a loner, and he's had a couple of good friendships here and there. But it's quite hard to imagine Van Gogh, although he seems to fantasize about ministering to the poor in this Dickensian thing. It's quite hard to imagine him actually interacting with lots of people all the time. It's hard to imagine him as a school teacher in a conventional sense. It's not that hard to think of him elevated above everyone else, like he's the teacher and all these boys listening to his wisdom. That to me is not that hard, because in a way, his letters to his brother are quite kind of instructive, right? And it's also not that hard to imagine him in a church, standing there with a church congregation below him, but nevertheless disconnected from him. In other words, I can imagine Van Gogh successfully being a pastor or a teacher as long as there's a distance between him and his students or the congregation. He seems to see it in a different way. He seems to see it as he's part of them. But I don't really see him as a guy that is too prickly and is too maybe well educated. I don't know, but there's something that separates him from, in a way, the ordinary man. It might be because he's such a deep dude. It might be because he's so culturally educated. It might be because he's got this deep, well-meaning philosophy that if he tried to communicate it to some of these people around him, it would go completely over their heads. And so you do get the sense that he's doomed in this thing that people just aren't going to understand him. I mean, in a school setting, in a preaching setting, and then even ultimately in an art setting. Even as an artist, people aren't going to understand his art because it's so rich and it's so deep. They're not going to appreciate what it's trying to address. And so that dooms him to loneliness, to aloneness, is because people don't get him, right? Does that make sense? So he's trying to find connections. He's trying to make connections with his contemporaries, with his society, but I don't think he's going to be able to, because he's been alone for such a long time. He's already separated from them through personal growth in a certain area. But it's two things at the same time. He's separated in a way that is advanced in a way internally, but in another way, he's probably got very poor social skills. So he might be someone like, in a way, Elon Musk, someone who's quite intellectually and sort of inwardly superior, like a thinker, but you spend so much time thinking that you've actually lost your touch, lost your personal touch. You've lost some of those social graces. You know what I mean? That's just the way I interpret it. Bridget says, sorry guys, I have to catch up later. I have a visitor at the door. Tara, oh Daisy and Delusional Fairy Tale. Yeah, Daisy's character from The Great Gatsby. I actually watched it the other day. I must say that's a book I really loved and one of the best written books I've ever read. And that's also quite unrealistic, quite flowery and unrealistic. Okay. So he's talking about the only real jobs in the world are either missionary or teacher. He says, last Sunday I went to London 2 or 3 times to find out if there was a chance of becoming one of them, as I speak a number of languages and have mixed, especially in Paris and London, with people of the lower classes and foreigners. Being a foreigner myself, I thought I might be fit for it and might become increasingly so. However, one must be at least 24 years old, and at all events, I shall have to wait another year. Mr. Stokes says that he definitely cannot give me any salary because he can get teachers enough for just board and lodging, and that is true. But will it be possible for me to continue this way? I'm afraid not. It will be decided soon enough. So in a way, you can't blame him. Would you want to work just for board and lodging, especially if someone like Van Gogh, you're pretty well educated. Would you want to, so he kind of wants more, whatever that is. Stephanie says, sometimes I feel you are misunderstood. No kidding. No, well, I appreciate that. But yeah, I think that is definitely true. I've definitely had that thing of, because you've written, so just a simple example, because you've written so many books on the Chris Watts case, let me say that again, because you've written so many books on the Chris Watts case, none of your books mean anything. It's that kind of irony. It's like, and you kind of scratch your head and say, isn't it the opposite? Because you've written so many books, you should know the most about the Chris Watts case, or you should be the expert in the Chris Watts case. Instead, most people, if you said, do you know of any author who's written more than one book on the Chris Watts case? Virtually everyone would say, no, I don't know who. So it's kind of that thing. So someone who's written one book is credible. Someone who's written 14 books is, I don't know what, not credible. But it is what it is. So anyway, it goes on to say, my boy, however this may be, one thing I can repeat, these few months have bound me so strongly to the sphere that extends from schoolmaster to clergyman, as much by the pleasures connected with those professions as by the thorns which have pricked me, that I cannot draw back anymore. So I have to go on, ! I can assure you that some very peculiar difficulties will present themselves right away, and others are looming in the distance. One is in quite a different world from that of Goupil and Key. When will I get those small engravings of Christus Consolator and Renumerator, which you promised me? Write to me as soon as you can find a moment, but send your letter to Father, as my address will probably change very soon, and he will know it first. Last week, I was at Hampton Court to see the beautiful gardens and long avenues of horse chestnuts and lime trees, in the tops of which a multitude of crows and rooks have built their nests, and also to see the place and the paintings. Among other things, there are many portraits by Holbein, which are very beautiful, 2 splendid Rembrandts, the portrait of his wife and of a rabbi, beautiful Italian portraits by Bellini, Titian, a picture by Leonardo da Vinci, cartoons by Mantegna, a beautiful picture by S. Ruysdael, A Still Life of Fruit by Coop, etc. I wish you had been there with me. It was a pleasure to see pictures again. It's quite interesting that he is going down this path, but he still has this love of pictures, of paintings that he's carrying with him. He's going down a different path, but that is still within him. And involuntarily, I thought of the persons who had lived there at Hampton Court, of Charles I and his wife. She's the one who said, "Thank you, Lord, for making me a queen, but an unhappy queen," at whose tomb Bossuet spoke from the fullness of his heart. Do you have Bossuet's Oraisons funèbres? Don't know how to say that. Oraison funèbre. In it, you will find that speech. There's a very cheap edition, I think, for 50 centimes. And I thought also of Lord and Lady Russell, who must have been there very often. Guizot described their lives in L'amour dans le marriage. Anyway, the dance, something about love and the dance of marriage. You must read that when you can lay your hands on it. Enclosed a feather from one of the rooks here. So I don't know if you remember previously, he sent seaweed from Ramsgate. Now he's sending a feather from a rook, basically a crow's feather. Write as soon as you can. I long to hear from you. Believe me, with a handshake. And then he encloses a sketch of a house in Alworth. So he's already doing a little bit of drawing. He's trying to express certain sentiments to his brother, and at the same time, he accompanies that with a sketch. And that process of words accompanied by pictures is probably going to be a kind of programming that is going to get him where he needs to go as an artist. I'm talking about words trying to describe something, giving up to some extent, and then doing a sketch in lieu of more words, kind of thing. And then you almost have the opposite happening, more and more elaborate paintings, and then words to describe what the painting can't. Okay, Isleworth, 8 July 1876, care of Jones Esquire, Holm Court. Dear Theo, it's a letter from Vincent to Theo. Your letter and the prints were a delightful surprise. They came this morning while I was busy weeding the potatoes in the garden. Many thanks, both the engravings, Christus Consolator, and the Remunerator are hanging over the desk in my little room. God is righteous, and he will lead all who err onto the right path. You were thinking of that when you wrote, "May this happen. I'm erring in many ways, but I don't despair. Do not be unhappy about your luxurious life, as you call it. Go quietly on your way. You are more simple-hearted than I am, and probably you will reach your goal quicker and to a greater extent." It's a weird compliment to give someone. You are more simple-hearted than I am. What does it mean to be simple-hearted? Maybe it means to have basic goals in life, like having a job. What is the opposite of being simple-hearted? Well, to have this deep kind of unvoiceable, it's like quite difficult to say what it is. This sort of unvoiced sense of being inspired by something that you don't quite know what it is or what it's doing to you. You don't quite know what this thing is that is kind of capturing you up. Stephanie says to find joy in the simple things. I'm not quite sure if that is, because if he says you are more simple-hearted than I am, if you think about Vincent's last months of his life, he takes joy in the landscape. He takes joy in walks. He takes joy in, a very simple kind of existence. I mean, I'm not saying the art side is simple, but the rest of it certainly is. It's something quite interesting to think about. He says, don't delude yourself about the liberty I have. I'm bound in different ways, some even humiliating. and these will become still worse in time. But the words engraved above the image of Christus Consolator, he has come to proclaim liberty to the captives, are true to this day. So you can see it's really quite, it's quite, I just had the word, I think I'm just quite tired. It's quite, what's the word? Not flamboyant. It's not flamboyant. It's well, the right word isn't sophisticated, but it's kind of quite advanced. The direction that he's going into in terms of his mind, in terms of his consciousness, as a 23-year-old, it's definitely quite advanced stuff. This mission that he's taking on. Then he says, now I must ask you something. While in The Hague, I had lessons from a Bible teacher, Hill, who then lived in the Bayenstraat. Bachnestraat. He took great pains over me, though I didn't show it. What he told me made an impression on me. Though I didn't show it, what he told me made an impression. I should like to send him a word, and if possible, do him some small favor. Go and visit him if you have a moment, and if you can find his address, and tell him that I have become a schoolmaster and am looking out for some other situation in connection with the church. He's a very simple man who I think has had many struggles in life. Involuntarily, I sometimes thought when looking at him, the end of that man will be peace. Some of his language here reminds me of Jesus in the Bible. Just think about what Jesus said and how the Bible reads when I read this again. Go and visit him if you have a moment, and if you can find his address, and tell him that I have become a schoolmaster and am looking out for some other situation in connection with the church. But just the way that he instructs his brother to do certain things and to speak to certain people, kind of on his behalf. Then he says, and give him the enclosed little drawing from me, how I should like to have a glimpse of Marv's place. I can see distinctly what you described seeing that evening you were there. Write again soon. Best wishes. Believe me always, your loving brother, Vincent. Then he says, give my kind regards to Mr. Tierstig and his wife and Betsy and the Roos family, but do not speak about me. As you see, I landed in that other school after all. Enclosed, you will find 2 prospectuses. If you can recommend the school to anybody who wants to send his boy to England, please do. Letter from Vincent to Theo, 2nd of August, 1876. Dear Theo, I heard from Father that you intended to come home one day while Anna and Elizabeth were there. Tell me if you did. Yesterday, Mr. Jones and his family came home. I had decorated the boys' dining room with a welcome home on the wall of holly and ivy and large bouquets on the table. So, I find this quite difficult to imagine. The deep thinking and somewhat prickly Van Gogh, the Van Gogh that you see in his self-portraits, he sort of looks a little bit haunted. This guy, right? Putting up welcome home, decorating a wall full of holly and ivy and putting large bouquets on the table. I'll just have a little bit of a difficulty seeing that. Then he says there's a lot of holly in the garden and they've cut away all the branches from the few old trees. These are now full of young shoots, quite white or yellowish, with an occasional pink leaf. And that is very beautiful. I gathered a large bunch of it to put on the table. I think the reason why I have trouble seeing it is because Van Gogh ends up being a bachelor his whole life. You get the sense that he's quite rough around the edges, that he's considerate in a sort of an intellectual way, and he's considerate in a in an intellectual way, is not really considerate so much in a personal way, like in a regular personal way. What I mean is, if you have someone, if you're married, you've got a wife or a girlfriend, or you've got children, then you have to be considerate. It's not even considerate. You've got to look after somebody else. You've got to do all sorts of things for them. And the reality is, if you're alone, you think about yourself, but naturally you think about yourself because you're just with yourself. So this whole idea of thinking about someone else, you've got to force yourself to do that, or you've got to remind yourself to do that, because you've had so little practice. Whereas that kind of thing comes naturally to anyone who's a mom or a dad, or in a family situation like that. He's kind of perpetually not. So that's, I think, why I've got a bit of a problem thinking of him mixing with other people in a way that's truly considerate. Hypothetically or theoretically, you can see what he wants to do, but practically it sort of is difficult to imagine. Just because he's becoming a person separate from the world. His art connects him to the world, but and I think he wants to be part of the world. That's the challenge that he's facing. He says they are now full of young shoots, quite white or yellowish, with an occasional pink leaf, and that is very beautiful. I gathered a large bunch of it to put on the table. You've got to think that part of what's going on here is someone who's got too much time on his hands, too much time alone. And so what is he doing? He's writing letters to his brother, talking about, describing even the colors of the shoots and plants in the garden in terms of decorating some kind of welcome home for the schoolboys. It's detail, yes it is, but it's also kind of, what's the word? It's arguably inconsequential. But this is what he's doing because he's got so much time on his own. Then he says, Mr. Jones asked me if I could tell him the price of 50 pounds of butter in Holland. If it is not too expensive, he intends to have it sent over from Holland regularly. Please ask Mr. Roos how much it is and write to me as soon as possible. I suppose the boys will arrive soon now. Have you ever read the story of Elijah and of Elisha carefully? I reread them over the last few days, and I'm sending you an enclosure on what I've written on the subject. What a moving story it is! ! I similarly reread in the Acts the story of Paul, when he found himself at the edge of the sea and everyone fell on his neck and kissed him. I was touched by this sentence of Paul: God comforts the simple people. This is a theme that comes up over and over again, this idea that simplicity is good. Simplicity is right. And one of the most famous paintings of Vincent van Gogh in the early days is, I think it's called The Potato Eaters, which is a celebration essentially of simple people in a simple situation. Then he goes on to say, it is God who made man, and it is he who may enrich in their lives with moments and times of life sublime, also with marvelous states of the soul. The sea was made, the oak was made, but man, made in the image of his Father, is fairer than the sea. Nevertheless, the sea is beautiful. Mr. Stokes's home is infested with bugs, but the spectacle of the sea contemplated from the window is unforgettable. The heart of a carnal man sometimes succumbs to a violent desire, is the view of those who preach and work for him, who has given them some sort of a baptism of the Holy Spirit and of fire. Those you see, their eyes sweep again in sadness when they think of their youth and to the good of those he quenched. their sublime peace they have now is nevertheless worth more than their deceitful tranquility of before, because tranquility and real peace begin only from the moment where there is nothing left in which to rest, and that one no longer loves anything on earth except God. They lament, woe is me, and they beg, who will save me from this mortal body? It is perhaps the best age of their lives, and very glad are those that attain these high summits. There's another paragraph that I'm not going to read. It's just more of that. Then he says, yesterday I took a lovely walk along the Thames. On the other side, there were beautiful country places and gardens. It was a sky such as Racedahl or Constable would have painted. So again, he's in some of his breaks between whatever, work or certain ruminations, he goes out into nature, and then he sees nature through an art Theo. And this one was written very quickly in pencil. Dear Theo, just now Van Ittersen came to surprise me. I am pleased that he has come, but it is as if he is a man from another world. So much lies between the time when we were together in the business and now. I think he probably feels the same way about Vincent, that he's now gone off to another world. I'm sending you The Wide, Wide World and another little book. Give one of them to Caroline. How I wish that you could see what it is like here sometime. On Saturday morning at 4 o'clock, I hope to walk to London to visit Gladwell and others. I wish that you could walk with me. A hearty handshake in my thoughts. Adieu. So I can't actually provide you with a link to this particular letter. There's a postscript here saying that this note Vincent wrote very quickly was when Tianus van Ittersen, who was a colleague of his in the London branch, dropped in unexpectedly to see him. So here, when a former colleague drops in on him, you can kind of tell there's a bit of a awkwardness between the two. Vincent's become someone else, and this dude is kind of a reminder of, in a way, the real world, in a way of reality, in a way of a reality that he's abandoned and abandoning. It says here, in all probability, Vincent seized the opportunity for Van Ittersen to take the note and the 2 books back to London with him, and from there send them to Theo using the company's mail. Let's see if I can read this in the original Dutch. Waarde Theo, daar juist komst Van Ittersen my verrassen. Ek vind het prettig dat hy kom, maar of hy een mens uit die andere wêreld is, soveel ligter tussen den tyd dat wij samen in de zaak waren en nu. Hierby die wyde wêreld en een ander boekje geef ook een daarvan aan Caroline. Wat zou ik graag willen gee? Wat zou ik graag willen gee het ook eens zin komt hier. Zaterdag morgen 4 uur hoop ik maar naar Londen te wandelen om Gladwell en anderen op te zoeken. Ik wil gij mede kon wandelen in hartelijken handdruk in gedachten. Adieu, gelooft mij, uw liefd broer Vincent. I don't know. I've probably really crucified. I've slaughtered the language there. I'd need a couple of more times to go through it to do it a bit better than that. The Dutch can understand about 50%, 60% when we speak Afrikaans. We can understand maybe 30, little bit less, 30-40% when. So in other words, if someone speaks Dutch, you can figure a lot of it out because it's derivative. Afrikaans is derivative from Dutch. Okay, letter from Vincent to Theo, 18 August 1876. Dear Theo, yesterday I went to see Gladwell, who is home for a few days. A terrible blow has struck them. His young sister, so full of life, with dark eyes and hair, had fallen from a horse at Blackheath. They found her unconscious and she died 5 hours later without regaining consciousness. She was 17 years old. Well, that's quite sad, isn't it? So he arrives to visit Gladwell, and at the time that he's there, no, I think actually what happened was Gladwell was home because his sister had died, and yeah, it wasn't while Van Gogh was there. He says, as soon as I heard the news, I went to see them, knowing that Gladwell was home. I left at 11 o'clock and had a long walk to Lewisham. I crossed London from one end to the other and didn't arrive at my destination until almost 5 o'clock. They had all just come back from the funeral. The whole household was in mourning. I was happy to have come out, but confused, truly upset by the spectacle of a pain so great and so venerable. Blessed are they that mourn, blessed are they that sorrow, but always rejoice. Blessed are the pure in heart, for they shall see God. He goes on to say, I chatted for a long time until evening with Harry about everything. The kingdom of God, the Bible. We chatted further. We walked up and down the station platform. Never will we forget the moments before we said goodbye. So one does get a sense here that there's quite a strong connection, certainly from Van Gogh's side to Gladwell, and that he's quite a good friend. He goes to see his friend. He goes to a lot of trouble to see his friend, even though he doesn't have any money, and even though it's at this awkward time where his sister has died, and he wants to minister to his friend, and he does. Then he goes on to say, he and I, we know each other intimately. His work is mine. I know as well as he the people that he knows down there. Their lives are as mine. From him, I've been given an urge to dive into the history of this family. I love these people more now than that I know their history in detail, because now I can sympathize with them on their existence and style of life. Paddy says showing up counts. So then we walked up and down the platform of the station, an ordinary world, but we were animated by thoughts that were not ordinary. Such moments do not last long, and soon we had to part. From the train, the view of London was beautiful, squatting in its gloom with St. Paul's and the other churches in the distance. I went by train to Richmond and by foot to Isleworth along the Thames, a fine walk. To the left, there are parks with their poplars, their oaks, and gigantic elms. To the right, the river which reflects their images. The evening is fine, somewhat solemn. I got back home at 10:15. So something just to consider is this is 1876, and Van Gogh is turned on by the idea of being a pastor. Now you must remember that a long time ago, certainly in his time, the centerpiece of a town tended to be a church. A long time ago in Van Gogh's time, typically the tallest building in a city or a town tended to be the church. Today we don't see that. Today we don't recognize that, because today we have skyscrapers, and skyscrapers only came onto the scene really in the 1920s. So around about 30 to 40 years after these letters were being written. So you can kind of almost see that the church is both a sign of kind of importance in terms of the structure that the church has in knitting together a community, but also the way that the church, in terms of the steeple, rises up above the community and sort of overlooks it and protects it. And so you can kind of understand how Van Gogh as a young man was quite enamored and quite inspired and quite caught up in this idea of being a church dude in the Dickensian sense, right? Stephanie says, my childhood church closed because the numbers dropped so much. I know when I went to church as a school kid and when I was at varsity, the church I went to was packed. They actually had to build a balcony onto it. It was just full, and they would have several services. And when I went there again many years later, it was pretty damn empty. There was like just the first 5-6 rows were full. So times have definitely changed. I feel like today we worship at the altar of social media. So just going back a bit further, he says, going a bit further down the letter, he says, I'm still full of what happened yesterday. I wanted to console the father, but I felt embarrassed in front of him, although I was able to speak to the son. The atmosphere of that house was truly holy. So there you have kind of a confirmation or reinforcement of what I've been saying, is that although Van Gogh feels these things, the reality is he's not very good with people. The reality is he's already disconnected from people. He doesn't have a natural feel for, it's not charismatic. It's not charismatic. It's not a charming, sociable, friendly fellow. He's more of a bookish, internalized guy. He's a thinker. So, and when you are in a situation of ministering to people, you've got to be a talker and a toucher, and it's less thinking and more doing. It's more personable, right? It's more personal. Then he says, have you read A Life for a Life by the author of John Halifax? I am sure you would like that. How is your English coming? It was delightful to take a long walk once more. Here at school, they walk very little. When I think of my life full of struggle in Paris last year and compare it with this, where I sometimes do not get out of doors the whole day, at least not further than the garden, I sometimes wonder, when shall I come back to that other world? If I go back to it, it will probably be doing other work than last year. So he's talking about, he's comparing life in Ramsgate to working in Paris, and he's comparing it unfavorably. He's saying, sorry, I've got like this hiccup that's trying to come out. He says, I sometimes do not get out of doors the whole day. Sorry. I drank kind of a meal replacement shake, and it's bubbling down there. Okay, so he says, I sometimes don't get out of doors all day, and so I sometimes wonder. What do you think that means? Well, he sometimes wonders, did he make the right decision? Is he in the right place? And I can tell you that's got to be a horrible, can you imagine, like when you're at school, you like stuck at school, like for the whole day, you're stuck and you look at the clock and all that kind of thing. Now, can you imagine choosing to be in that situation as a teacher, going back to that situation where you are stuck in that indoorsy setting of timetables and schedules and classes, and you can't get out of it, right? Then he says, I think I like teaching Bible history to the boys better than walking. That's interesting. One feels more or less safe in doing the former. And now kind regards to Russ and to anybody who may ask after me. A handshake in thought and best wishes from your loving brother Vincent. Then he also says, I write between school hours and rather in a hurry, as you can see. And And now let's go on to the next letter. 26 August 1876. Well, I thought we were going to get through this year a lot quicker. Dear Theo, enclosed you will find a note from Mr. Tierstig. The last time I wrote to him, I was still in Paris. We have not lost track of each other since I left The Hague. The morning is beautiful. The sunlight falls across the enormous acacias in the courtyard. It lights up the roofs and windows visible beyond the garden. There are already gossamer threads in the garden. It makes the morning fresh and the boys run left and right to warm themselves up. I intend to recount to them this evening in the dormitory the story of John and Theogenes. Blah, blah, blah. Every day we study the Bible. This gives us the best feelings of joy. No day passes without praying to God and without talking about him. For the moment, my talks about him leave much to be desired, but it will get better with his help and blessing. What is really interesting with this time and the letters he's writing here is how they contrast to the content of his letters when he's in Norvège, where he virtually doesn't mention God at all. He virtually doesn't mention Bible verses at all. That's not to say that some of those, if you want to use the word religious, whether some of those religious impulses aren't there. They are just to some extent subterranean, pushed down, internalized. The landscape through which the path runs is very beautiful. Brown heathland with birches and pine trees here and there, and patches of yellow sand. And in the distance, the mountains against the sun. Truly, it is not a picture, but an inspiration. So you're getting this mix of the religious, the holy, the divine, and then these ordinary landscapes that he sees that to him are inexpressibly beautiful and inspiring. And that is what eventually comes together. I'm writing to you between lessons. Today I took a few moments off to go for a walk between the hedgerows with John and Theogenes to study it. How I wish you could see the playground and the garden beyond now in the twilight. Well, if he had a cell phone, he could have just taken a photo and maybe also a video, but he didn't. All he had was pen and paper and, you know, the idea of sketching some of these scenes and describing some of these scenes. The other thing to bear in mind is he's often away from those he loves. So if he wants to connect with them, if he wants to communicate with them, he's then got to express what he's seeing around him. And that becomes essentially his job. It becomes a habit of expressing to someone who's somewhere else what he is seeing and experiencing. And that then becomes something that he gets more and more practice at, not only in words, but in pictures. And then eventually the pictures take over. He says, now and then one of them starts to hum a snatch of some hymn or other. Oh, hold on. So this is what I quite like about this paragraph, this moment, is it reminds you in a shingly sort of way that this actually happened, that there was this moment where the real person that was Van Gogh, and maybe if you saw him, maybe you'd think, wow, he's a lot thinner than I thought, or maybe he's a lot uglier than I thought, or his hair's a lot longer than I imagined, or whatever. But there he is, and there he is actually got a pen in his hand, not a ballpoint pen, and he's scribbling whatever he's saying, and things are happening around him. There's a context to it. And so Yeri actually describes that context. He says, the gas is flickering in the school and one can hear the companionable sound of the boys at their lessons. Now and then one of them starts to hum a snatch of some other hymn or other, and then there is something of the old faith in me. I'm still far from being what I want to be, but with God's help I shall succeed. I want to be bound to Christ with unbreakable bonds and to feel these bonds, to be sorrowful yet always rejoicing, to live in and for Christ. Then he thanks his brother for the postcard, and that's it. And then he says, postscript, one word more. I've just been telling the story of John and Theogenes, first in the dormitory, then in the upper room where there are 4 more. I told it in the dark, and they had gradually all fallen asleep before I had finished speaking. So this is Van Gogh doing some ASMR in Ramsgate. No wonder, for they have raced about a great deal today on the playground. And then you see, I do not speak without difficulty. How it sounds to English ears, I do not know, but practice makes perfect. I think the Lord has taken me as I am, with all my faults, though I am still hoping for more profound acceptance. Tomorrow evening, I must tell the same story to the assistant and 2 older boys who could stay up later. I kind of get the feeling that although it's very highfalutin and it's very deep, in a weird way, it feels like Van Gogh is trying to have a sense of family. He doesn't know that. He's confusing that with these very sort of advanced things of, a mission from God and so on. But in a very basic sense, I get the feeling that he's longing for that intimacy that dispels loneliness that you have in a family situation. And he can have some of those intimacies I'm just talking about regular intimacies, warmth and closeness in the setting of a school and in the setting of kind of a church setting. He wants that closeness with other people, but really what he wants is closeness with people like him or people that know him, not in a job situation. That's what I think he's confusing here. He's confusing it because he's caught up in this idea of being inspired by everything. He wants to be inspired by everything. And he doesn't see that, well, you can be inspired in a sense, but there's also it's like what Edison said, genius is 1% inspiration, 99% perspiration. At this point, and a lot of us get caught up in that, especially when we're young, at this point, Van Gogh thinks, no, I want it to be 99% inspiration. I want to be inspired. I want to be floating on a cloud of inspiration. It's a bit naive. It's a bit unrealistic. When I wrote this book, for example, there was a lot of inspiration, but it takes a lot of work to write a book, to have the discipline to, in a way, push that inspiration aside and make it legible and accessible and sensible. Here's another book that I wrote, still in manuscript form, never published. And this is also a huge amount of perspiration. That is the reality of art and artists, is perspiration. The inspiration is there and it's important, but it can't all be inspiration. And it is very tempting. It's the same with love. You think that you want to be in love the whole time. At some point, you need to get off the bed, disengage your lips, put your clothes on and make breakfast, take out the garbage, open your mail and look at what the bills are, get in your car and go to work and bring home the bacon and all that kind of thing. How much of love is the good stuff, and how much of love is the labor of love, the taking the kids to school, the doing the homework with the kids, and that is just life. And some people haven't gotten the memo. Some people think and want to insist on life being this fairy tale of high moments with no low moments or no ordinary moments in them. And one wonders whether, and I don't know if there's like some folks who are not members, I don't know if I'm going to now repel you with saying these words, but someone like Johnny Depp, who has this incredible life in the movie business. I think he's made 40 movies and is incredibly successful. I see, I've just lost 2 people watching. There we go. But one wonders whether that psychology is of, I want to be inspired the whole time. I've just lost somebody else. There you go. I want to be inspired the whole time. I want to be on this high the whole time. I don't know how to deal with these moments that are not amazing. I don't know how to deal with whatever connects one high moment to another high moment. What do you do with that? Do you get what I'm saying? Part of the mastery of life is ordinary living. The hours that span between one roller coaster ride and the next. Terry Dean says, happiness is joy in the mundane. You can take an absolutely ordinary scene like this. I'll never forget reading The Power of Now, where Eckhart Tolle talks about he was sitting and he just watched the curtain fill with light. I think it was in the dawn. And he was like infused with this incredible joy just by seeing the way the light was touching the room. I don't know if you guys remember that. I don't know how many of you have read that. And that was him just being so, and then he, I think, sat on a park bench and everything was just so incredibly magical. A blade of grass was the most beautiful thing he'd ever seen. The spontaneity that out of this fabric, a butterfly could bounce through the air, a butterfly literally moving unattached to the ground, unaffected by gravity, doing its thing, and yet that's life, and it's so incredible. The buzz of life, the electricity of life. Looking at something like this, a glass, it's almost like air knitted together into something that is cool and round, and it can hold water, and just how magical that is. I remember saying to somebody once how spoiled we are in the 20th and 21st century. We are so spoiled. We will complain about the food that we ate, right? We'll complain about it and say, oh, it's so terrible. But you don't see the magic that you were sitting in a chair that was flying higher than Everest through the sky while you were eating with a knife and fork, whatever it was, tiramisu, meatballs and mash, whatever it was. The wonder of, I mean, in a technical sense, you were sitting in a chair, eating a meal with a knife and fork while flying through the sky above the height of Mount Everest, which not many people reach, and meanwhile getting to your destination. But you want to complain that the food didn't taste very nice. And obviously in an airplane, it wasn't just you doing that, but it was lots of other people, which in a way makes it even more incredible. But nevertheless, if you think about some of the things that we have, it is actually quite magical. If you could go to a San Bushman in the time of cave art, while he was painting his thing on the wall, and show him a cell phone, and I don't know, have him talk to another tribe around the corner and say, like, dude, what is your intention? Are you going to attack us tomorrow? It would blow their minds. It'd be like, this is amazing, and we take it completely for granted. And who knows what the technology is going to be 10, 20 years from now. Holograms, flying cars, holidays on the moon. Instead of going on a cruise, you go on a cruise through space, all that kind of thing. It sounds crazy, but it's actually very likely if the world can hold itself together. So you don't need to have these incredible experiences to find meaning in the ordinary. It's there for the taking. Just a change of perspective. It's a change of attitude. That's why I say when I wrote about true crime, I was like, I'm not going to be able to do this unless I can find a way to reach the level of meaning I need in these contemporary stories. And so I kind of went beyond, they talk about going the extra mile. I would go quite a few extra miles in these high profile stories to make it meaningful to me. And thank goodness you guys found it meaningful as well. Real Batman says, so we beat on, boats against the current, borne back ceaselessly into the past. Amazing lines, definitely amazing. Anyway, he says, the hour is very late and the rules do not allow me to work so late. Soon I am going to smoke a pipe in the courtyard. It is nice there, also in the little courtyard where a pig has his liberty during most of the year. He's not there at the moment. In truth, it is amusing to amble about a while. Good night, handshake from your loving brother, Vincent. Okay. I thought you were going to get through 1876 a lot sooner. Letter from Vincent to Theo, Isleworth, 1st September. Mijn oog oorween niet meer, maar houdt oor tranen. Mijn ziele treer niet meer, maar bid, mijn ziel. That, I did a bit better there, right? Mine eye, oh, weep no more, but hold your tears. My soul, mourn no more, but pray, my soul. Dear Theo, thanks for your letter I received this morning. There are hours and days and periods in life when God hides his countenance, as it were. But for those who love God, those times, those sad times, are not wholly devoid of God. I'm going to skip the next part. Then he says, it was an autumn day when I stood on the steps before Mr. Proverly's school, watching the carriage in which Pa and Mother were driving home. One could see the little yellow carriage far down the road, wet with rain and with spare trees on either side, running through the meadows. The grey sky above it was all mirrored in the pools. Now, I don't know about you, but I could actually see that. I could see that yellow carriage disappearing down the road. Quite descriptive, isn't it? And about a fortnight later, I was standing in the corner of the playground when someone came and told me that a man was there asking for me. I knew who it was, and a moment later, I fell on Father's neck. What I felt then could it have been because ye are sons, okay, blah, 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 blah. Then written in the margin, he says, do you ever go to communion? They that be whole need not a physician, but they that are sick. Between that moment and the present day lie years of exile. There is a phrase that accompanies us and seems to grow with us, sorrowful yet always rejoicing. He keeps saying that, doesn't he? There is the prayer for a mother, for her children, a prayer which is very powerful. For the prayer of the righteous is great power. Father, I pray unto thee, not that thou shouldest take them out of the world, but that thou shouldest keep them from the evil. There is the faithful hand of the Father which blessed us when we left the parental home. And then, boy, as I told you before, there's a strong craving for the day when he will no longer remember the sins of my youth. Who rejoices in gray hairs? And then there's some more poetry. I'm not going to read it. It goes on and on. I'm not going to read. This is just such a really long letter. Oh God, many a time hath he changed thy burden into happiness. More poetry. Really, 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 really long letter. I'm still going through it, still scrolling down. Still going down. Wow. Really, really, really long letter. Still going on. Wow. Whoa. Okay, so I'm not going to continue this letter, but you can have a look at it here if you're interested. That is a really long letter. It goes on. But it's filled with pretty much the same sentiments. 3rd of October, 1876. Dear Theo, our parents have written to me that you are ill. My boy, I wish I could be with you. Remember the parents writing about how concerned they were and that he actually survived. Last night I went on foot to Richmond. I thought of you all the time. It was a beautiful grey evening. You know that every Monday I go to the Methodist Church at Richmond, every Monday. Yesterday I spoke a few words on the subject. Nothing pleases me except Jesus, and everything pleases me in God. I think what that means is he actually gave a short sermon in Richmond. I would like to be closer to you. Oh, why are we always at odds with each other? Why? I'm enclosing a letter from the aunts at Zundert. You know that Aunt Bet had an accident. I wrote to them that you and I would walk over to Zundert at Christmas if possible. I have copied a few of the Psalms for you. Perhaps you would like to read them. A week from last Sunday, I made a long trip to London, and there I heard about a kind of job which perhaps might do for me sometime. In seaport towns like Liverpool and Hull, certain preachers are often in need of helpers who know how to speak several languages to work among the sailors, foreigners, and visit the sick. Some salary is attached to such a position. I know I'm not Van Gogh, but this reminds me of when I was in England for a year. I came back for a couple of months. When I returned, I made up my mind that I was going to work on oil rigs. I wanted to make a lot of money fast. I didn't care if it was dangerous. In fact, I wanted it to be a little bit dangerous and sort of outdoors. I went to Aberdeen. I went to sort of go and work on these oil rigs. And then I think they said something about you've got to do a safety course, and the next safety course is then. So I can't do it now. And then I went to Edinburgh to sort of wait for the time to be right. And then I got a job in Edinburgh, and then someone invited me to come to Bristol, a girl that I'd met somewhere else. And then I ended up never going on the oil rigs. But this whole thing about working among the sailors reminds me a little bit of that door that I was potentially going to go through. He says, I left here early at 4 o'clock in the morning. It was beautiful in the park here with the avenues of dark elm trees, the wet road through it, and a grey, rainy sky above it all. In the distance, there was a thunderstorm. At daybreak, I was in Hyde Park. The leaves were already falling from the trees, and the Virginia creeper was beautifully red against the houses, and there was a fog. At 7 o'clock, I was in Kensington. That's, I think, where Lady Diana used to have a palace. I've actually been there. And rested a little in a church where I used to go so many Sunday mornings. So that was when he used to live in London. In London, I visited some friends and also the Gupil Key Gallery, and saw there the drawings that Van Ittersen had brought with him. It was delightful to see once more the Dutch towns and meadows in that way. That picture by Arts, the mill on the canal, I think very fine. You also have a beautiful life before you, Theo. Keep courage. Has Van Ittersen come back yet? I was so glad to see him again. He is bringing you the wide, wide world. Read it one of these days. The first chapters especially are so fine and so true and simple. And read it now and then in Longfellow, for instance. I see the lights of the village gleam through the rain and the mist, and a feeling of sadness comes over me that my soul cannot resist. Quite interesting. And then he sort of signs off with this postscript. Paris will be beautiful now in autumn. Every Sunday last year, Gladwell and I visited many friends and as many churches as possible. We went out in the morning and came home late. Notre Dame is so splendid in the autumn evening amid the chestnut trees. But there's something in Paris more beautiful than the autumn and the churches, and that is the poor. I think often of so many over there. Quite an extraordinary thing to say. There's something in Paris more beautiful than the autumn and the churches, and that is the poor. So again, like I said, something like Notre Dame is going to be, at the time, the Notre Dame was probably, there was no Eiffel Tower in Paris. So that would be one of the biggest buildings, the most important structures in Paris. And so you have this incredible giddy sense of God's work and the power of God, because his father's a missionary, and the place that the church holds in a city and in a town, that the work that he wanted to do was important. You can kind of get a sense of that, in a sense that I don't think you can think about or comprehend from the perspective of today, because things have changed so much today. What is the other thing? Just for those of you interested, my friend Alex, who died in October, I think his wife said the following at his funeral. She said that she just remembered some of these highlights from his life, and she remembered that they went into the Notre Dame, and I'm not sure if it was the same day. I think it was the same day. So they went into the Notre Dame, lit one or two candles, and then when they looked again, the Notre Dame burned down. Like that day, they were in the Notre Dame the day that it burned down. How's that? Quite weird. Stephanie says digital art is really neat, but so is paintbrush and canvas. Stephanie says, I wanted to be a Disney animator, but the advances in technology turned me off. Well, that's interesting. Stephanie, have you ever drawn Mickey Mouse? Have you drawn those figures? Because when I was a kid, my brother and I drew hundreds of Mickey Mouses and Donald Ducks, and that's quite challenging because you've got to get those ears perfectly round and the nose and the eyes perfectly round. Hundreds of times, yeah. Same here. Certainly, drawing those Disney figures gets you to get your proportions right and balance the features of your characters. You've got to be accurate. Okay, so let's go on to the next letter. I really didn't think 1876 would go on this much. Okay. Vincent to Theo, Isleworth, 7 October 1876. I'm going to read another 3 or 4 letters, and then we're going to be at about 2.5 hours, and I think we can end there. Dear Theo, it is Saturday again, and I write once more. How I long to see you again. Oh, my longing is sometimes so strong. Write soon a little word as to how you are. Last Wednesday, we took a long walk to a village an hour's distance from here. The road led through meadows and fields, along hedges of hawthorn, full of blackberries and clematis, and here and there a large elm tree. It was so beautiful when the sun set behind the grey clouds and the shadows were long. By chance we met the school of Mr. Stokes, where there are still several boys I knew. The clouds retained their red hue long after the sun had set, and the dusk had settled over the fields. And when we saw in the distance the lamps lit in the village, While I was writing to you, I was called to Mr. Jones, who asked if I would walk to London to collect some money for him. And when I came home in the evening, hurrah, there was a letter from father with tidings about you. How I should like to be with you both, my boy, and thank God there's some improvement, though you are still weak. And you will be longing to see mother. And now that I hear that you are going home with her, I think of the words of conscience. So 2 things just to emphasize here is this is a time where it wasn't that weird for someone to get sick and almost die, because it's not even the 19th century, and medicine is kind of primitive there. So it's still that time where you can get a cold and die. And in fact, as I understand it, that is what happened to the Van Gogh's father. The pastor got a cold. He sort of went out in the rain or something and got a cold and died, or he may have had a heart attack from it's also possible that that was the case, but I'm just saying it was a far more fraught and precarious life because you could get an infection or die of a cold in that time, compared to where we are today, where you can kind of reasonably expect to live a full life, right? I must say, last night I woke up in the middle of the night sweating, and it's really cold here, so I don't know whether I'm not well. I mean, I don't feel anything's wrong with me right now. I feel a bit cold, but I don't know what that was all about. I don't know whether I was having a nightmare or something, but I was literally sweating, even though it's cold. I actually went to watch a movie yesterday where the guy who gave the ticket looked sick and he was coughing. And I obviously know that you wouldn't get a sickness immediately. It does not transfer immediately. But yeah, so anyway, the one thing that they had to deal with was this threat to life, that can you expect to live for very long, right? And so, yeah, his brother faces, faces this affliction of some sort. But the other thing that I think is interesting is it was a much darker world then, meaning literally they didn't have electric lighting. I have mentioned it before. But not only that, you can kind of imagine, if you don't have electric lighting, if you're lighting candles, if you've got lamps, then when the sun goes down, although you got that sort of merry cottagey light like Pinocchio and Jiminy Cricket, you've got that Disney light with a candle and the lamp and so on, and it sort of flickers. It's nevertheless kind of a weak golden light. And so this whole idea of good and evil and the light and the darkness would have been quite a strong theme that you would see writ large in your life. If you wanted to read a book at night, you'd need to light a gas lamp that would flicker. And so can the light of the world, the light of the lamp, the light of your life, can it withstand the darkness? It would be a much stronger thing than it is today, where it feels like we've triumphed over the travails of life, where you flick a switch and the light goes on, you hit a button and it changes a channel, you Google something and you get the answer instantly. In that time, the environment was something you had to beat back a lot more. And that includes the darkness at night. Just something to bear in mind. It's easy to, without thinking about it, imagine then as now, but it would have been very different. Stephanie says, Alexa does that for me. Okay, yeah. So in a way, it's like going to another planet, going back 150 years, like going to another planet. And yet not. You can hear that the way that he writes is quite contemporary. The way that he thinks is somewhat contemporary. So he writes the following. Now I'm not going to read it. Just in the city, I went to see Mr. Gladwell and to St. Paul's Church, and from the city to the other end of London, where I visited a boy who had left the school of Mr. Stokes because of illness, and I found him quite well playing in the street. Then to the place where I had to collect the money for Mr. Jones. The suburbs of London have a peculiar charm. Between the little houses and the gardens are open spots covered with grass, and generally with a church or school or workhouse in the middle between the trees and shrubs. And it can be so beautiful there when the sun is setting red in the thin evening mist. Yesterday evening it was so, and afterwards I wished you could have seen those London streets when the twilight began to fall and the lamps were lit, and everybody went home, and everything showed that it was Saturday night, and in all that bustle there was peace. One felt the need of and the excitement at the approaching Sunday. Oh, those Sundays and all that is done and accomplished on those Sundays. It is such a comfort for those poor districts and crowded streets. So one can imagine on a Sunday in London, if you're a church worker or church person, then there are maybe soup kitchens and blankets given out to the poor and whatnot, cups of tea, whatever it is. In the city, it was dark, but it was a beautiful walk along the row of churches one has to pass. Near the Strand, I took a bus that took me quite a long way. It was already pretty late. I passed the little church of Mr. Jones and saw in the distance another one, where at that hour a light was still burning. I entered and found it to be a very beautiful little Catholic church where a few women were praying. Then I came to that dark park about which I have written you already, and from there I saw in the distance the lights of Isleworth, and the church with the ivy, and the churchyard with the weeping willows beside the Thames. Tomorrow I shall get for the second time some small salary for my new work, and with it buy a pair of new boots and a new hat. And then, with God's will, I shall go fitted out afresh. Wow, Gathering Place is here. Gathering Place has been a member for 3 months. Gathering Place, good to see you. I think we missed you in the previous live, so sorry about that. So he's gotten a little bit of money, and what does he do with his money? Well, he buys shoes and a hat, both the sort of thing that you need to on long walks, and also the sort of things he would need as an artist. He would also paint his shoes when he sort of ran out of stuff to paint, and the Mistral was blowing very hard. When he was in Arles, he would paint his shoes, and they would sort of looked worn out. That's actually the opening scene of At Eternity's Gate, which is really well done. You have Willem Dafoe playing the role of Vincent van Gogh, painting his shoes. He takes them off, puts them on the ground and paints them. And it's actually Willem Dafoe literally painting. Quite interesting. In the London streets, they sell scented violets everywhere. They flower here twice a year. I bought some for Mrs. Jones to make her forget the pipe I smoke now and then. So he buys flowers for Mrs. Jones so that she isn't so conscious of the pipe smoke in the house. He says he smokes the pipe especially late in the evening on the playground, but the tobacco here has a touch of gloom about it. So he quite likes the tobacco from home. Well, Theo, try to get well soon and read this letter when Mother is sitting with you, because I should like to be with you both in thought. I cannot tell you how glad I am that Mr. Jones has promised to give me work in this parish, in his parish, so that I shall find by and by what I want. I'm longing so much for you. A handshake for yourself, blah, blah, blah. This morning the sun rose so beautifully again. I see it every morning. When I wake the boys, adieu. So let me ask you a question. He's now just gotten another job, and his job is to be a pastor at a parish that is run by Mr. Jones. And he can't wait for his first opportunity to preach. That's kind of the next thing that is going to happen. So let me ask you, do you think Vincent's first sermon is going to be a success? What do you think? Do you think Vincent van Gogh's first sermon to this English parish is going to be a success? That was also quite a long letter. Wow. What do you guys think? Sneezy says, sadly, no. Yeah, sadly, probably not, right? Corporal Deb says, I think it may be okay. Okay. Stephanie says, I think not because you're asking. Okay. Patty says, sadly, no. Terry says, most probably they disliked the first sermon. Okay. I think he talks about it here. Let's see what he says. Well, we passed 2:35. I don't want to go on for too much longer, but let's just go through this. And this is to Mother and Theo from Vincent, 13th of October, 1876, from Isleworth. That's basically London. Dear Mother and Theo, tomorrow the boys go home and I shall receive my money. I asked Mr. Jones to let me go to you those 3 days. My heart is so with you. It depends now on you both. If you say that I may come, Mr. Jones will let me go. Besides longing to sit at Theo's bedside, I should like so much to see my mother again, and if possible, also go to Eton and see father and speak with him. It would only be for a short time. I shall be with you, but for 1 or 2 days. He probably wants to see his dad, to basically say, Dad, I'm following in your footsteps, kind of thing. Aren't you glad? Then Monday last, I was again in Richmond, and my subject was, so this is what he gives the sermon on. He has sent me to preach the gospel to the poor. So that's what he tells the congregation. God sent me to preach the gospel to the poor. But whoever wants to preach the gospel must carry it in his own heart first. Oh, may I find it, for it is only the word spoken in earnestness and from the fullness of the heart that can bear fruit. Perhaps I shall go to London or Lewisham again one of these days. Just now I gave a German lesson to Mr. Jones's daughter, and after the lesson I told them the story of Andersen's The Snow Queen. If you can, let me know by the next mail if I may come. I was so happy over Mother's last letter. One of these days I hope to visit Mr. Stokes' school, and I shall have to buy a pair of new boots to get myself ready for new wanderings. Also, he wants to buy more new boots, I guess. The view from the window of your little room must be fine now. You see, I know it from long ago. We are having a great deal of rain here at present in Holland. I suppose it is the same. At Christmas, I shall have a fortnight or 3 weeks to go to Holland. If Anna can go too, we might come together. And now winter is slowly approaching again. Try to be your old self by that time. How welcome is that Christmas time in winter? Oh, my boy, I look forward so much to the time when it will be cold here and I shall have to make my rounds at Turnham Green. So he's looking forward to the winter. And winters can be cozy in England and in the Netherlands. Think about log fires, Christmas trees, people skating, certainly in Holland, on the frozen ponds and canals. Probably can be quite cool. When I think of you as one who comforts his mother and who's worthy to be comforted by his mother, I almost envy you, but try to get better soon. This reminds me of a scene in Doctor Strange where the Scarlet Witch, where her sons that she's actually conjured, they're not real children, but because she's almost like a comic book version of Vincent van Gogh. It's someone who is so lonely and so lost. She's lost her partner, that she conjures a family because she's a witch. And then at one point she's in this conjuring, she puts her kids to bed, and the one child says to her, Mom, you don't need to do that anymore. You don't need to tuck me into bed. And then she goes over to the other boy and tucks him into bed. And then the other boy says, it's okay, Mom, you can actually tuck me into bed. The other boy sees how nice and comforting it is and decides, actually, I'm not old enough. I'm not ready to not be mothered. And so here you have Vincent thinking about his mother comforting his brother and saying, I almost envy you. Quite a touching moment. He says, let me hear soon from you again, and believe me, your loving brother Vincent. Okay, sorry, I thought that letter would be talking about his sermon. Let's see if we can try and get to it. So 24th of October, letter from Vincent to Theo. He says he's grateful for the note. Then 3 paragraphs down, he says, yesterday I was in Mr. Jones's church to help with the preparations for tonight. A clergyman from Leicester will then lecture on the Reformation and illustrate it by magic lantern with slides of that period. So this is going to be kind of a slideshow using kind of a lantern. I've already seen some of the pictures. They are in the style of Holbein. You know that many painters and graphic artists here work in that style. So this is their version kind of like of a PowerPoint presentation. He says there was a very beautiful picture of Luther's marriage. Last Monday, there was a tea meeting in that church. It was the anniversary of its opening. More than 250 people were at that tea, and afterward, Mr. Jones and a few other clergymen spoke until late in the evening. It has been very beautiful here lately, especially the streets in the evening when it is more or less hazy and the lamps are lit, and also in the park, which I wrote you about. A few days ago, I saw the sun setting there behind the elm trees with their bronze-colored leaves. Over the grass was that haze which Anna wrote about, and the brook which the swans swim in runs through the park. The acacia trees in the playground have almost lost their leaves. I see them through the window in front of my desk. Sometimes they stand out dark against the sky. Sometimes I see the sunrise red in the mist behind them. It will soon be winter now. I'm so glad Christmas comes in winter. That's why I like winter best of all the seasons. How delightful it will be to sail down the Thames and across the sea and see those friendly Dutch dunes and the church spire that is visible from so far away. That's quite amazing, is that from I think he's talking about crossing the channel and being able to see the dunes and the church spire of Holland as he's approaching by ship from England. He says, how little we see of each other and how little we see of our parents, and yet the family feeling and our love for each other is so strong that the heart is uplifted and the eye turns to God and prays. Okay, next letter. I hope it's this letter. Letter from Vincent van Gogh to Theo, 31st of October, 1876, Isleworth, London. Dear Theo, it is more than time for you to hear from me again. Thank God you are recovering. I'm longing so much for Christmas. Theo, your brother has preached for the first time last Sunday in God's dwelling, of which is written, in this place I will give peace. Enclosed a copy of what I said. May it be the first of many. So this is it. This is the first sermon that Vincent van Gogh gives. Is it the beginning of an incredible journey? Is he gonna become one of the world's best and beloved preachers? So this is it, and it refers to a week previously. It's quite interesting that he writes about that only a week later, which makes you wonder, has he been, the Afrikaans word is verwyd, has he been sort of reflecting on what happened and playing it back in his mind and kind of feeling bad about it, like thinking, okay, I should have done that differently. I should have been more expressive or less expressive or whatever it is. It also says, it was a clear autumn day and a beautiful walk from here to Richmond along the Thames. So he's so far not saying anything about it. Oh, he does in a second. Let's take it step by step. So he says, the day that he preached was a clear autumn day and a beautiful walk from here to Richmond along the Thames, in which the great chestnut trees with their load of yellow leaves and the clear blue sky were mirrored. So he's kind of seeing himself, Amy, good night. he sees himself walking to the church and in this amazing setting. He says, through the tops of the trees, one could see that part of Richmond which lies on the hill, the houses with their red roofs, uncurtained windows and green gardens, and the grey spire high above them. It's quite interesting how he sketches the scene rather than just saying, this is what I said and this is how it went. He talks about the grey spire high above them and below the long grey bridge with the tall poplars on either side, over which the people passed like little black figures. You can also imagine that in this time when people go to church, they all dress up, they dress in suits, and it's very respectable and very kind of somber. It's almost like going to a funeral. And then he starts. He says, when I was standing in the pulpit, I felt like somebody who, emerging from a dark cave underground, comes back to the friendly daylight. It is a delightful thought that in the future, wherever I go, I shall preach the gospel. To do that cell, one must have the gospel in one's heart. May the Lord give it to me. So this is incredibly portentous in terms of, like what's going to happen in the future. He talks about coming from a dark cave underground, coming out of darkness into the friendly daylight. And he will literally go from here to the Borinage, where he will literally preach the gospel to people coming out of the dark caves of coal mines back into the friendly daylight and preach the gospel to them. So it's pretty incredible the language that he uses to describe him preaching and where he goes from here. He also says the following. He says, you know enough of life, Theo, to understand that a poor preacher stands rather alone in the world. So there he's already giving you a glimpse that although this is a great moment for him, he kind of felt a little bit lonely. Maybe he felt a bit out of his depth. Remember, he's a Dutchman preaching in English to English people. And it's not his community, it's not his hometown. It's kind of it's not really a friendly audience. It's a foreign, unfamiliar group of people. And are they going to warm to him? And what's going to happen? And so he says he stands there in the pulpit and he feels a bit alone in the world. You sort of got to wonder, how do they look at him? Do they sort of take their handkerchiefs out of their pockets and wipe their noses while he's talking? Is there a bit of mumbling, like, who's this guy? What thoughts and what expressions does he see on all these faces? If only one could see that live streamed or see that moment, it would be quite amazing, just to see that interaction. Van Gogh propped up above everyone. Is he nervous? Is he, how does it go down? Then he says, boy, how I'm longing, so is that it? Boy, how I'm longing for Christmas and for you all. It seems to me I've grown years older in these few months. So saying that I've grown years older in these few months, you kind of get the sense that it didn't really go very well. He's also longing for home. He doesn't really talk much about the sermon except to say that he felt rather alone in the world. He doesn't speak much about it. You can imagine if it was this triumphant moment that he wouldn't be able to stop talking about it. Anyway, he says, yesterday evening I was again in Richmond and walked through a large grassy field surrounded by trees and houses over which the church spire rises. The dew was lying on the grass and the twilight was falling. On one side, the sky was still aglow from the setting sun. On the other, the moon was rising. So he's really observing what's happening around him. He doesn't just walk wherever he's going. He is absorbing it. He's seeing it. He is registering it. Under the trees, an old lady with beautiful grey hair was walking, dressed in black. In the middle of the grass plot, the boys had lit a bonfire, which one could see flickering from afar. I thought of the lines, "Once at the evening of my life, tired from care and strife, I'll bring thee praise more loud and fair for each day given to me here. Adieu, a handshake from your loving brother Vincent." Then he says, Thursday, this is a postscript, Thursday week, I hope to preach on John and Theogenes in Mr. Jones's church. Your brother was indeed deeply moved when he stood at the foot of the pulpit and bowed his head and prayed. And then he goes on, I think what one could say is possibly that the sermon that he gave went on for too long. One could maybe say that maybe he preached for too long and that wasn't a good idea. It is a very, 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 I'm scrolling down here, very, 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 very long sermon, which he'd written down, and so he obviously, Ivy, I think it's, so, so, you know, there she's made her appearance, how's that? Nisi says, I love the Van Gogh human sponge. Stephanie says he did write it down for Theo. Yeah. Now, it is a very long sermon, which I'm not going to even look at. Then there's another letter on the 10th of November, but I think we're going to leave it there. A couple more letters in November. This is a sketch he does of that church a little bit later, if you want to have a look at it. Then the next letter is from Eton, that's in December. And then we're in January 1877. So we were about 4 letters short of getting through 1876. And then I think he leaves England. So the next couple of letters are in Dordrecht. I think I actually went to Dordrecht when I was in the Netherlands. So the next period, so he didn't stay in England very long after that first sermon. He kind of gave 1 or 2 and then he was out. Then he went to Dordrecht, and then he went to Amsterdam, and then he was in the Borinage. So we will be dealing with the run-up to the Borinage. I don't think he writes a lot of letters while he's in the Borinage, so you kind of got to imagine that. But we've almost come to the end of his time, certainly in Ramsgate, and also England, where he's going to leave England for the last time and then go back to Holland, to Dordrecht, and then also Amsterdam. And I think he works in a bookshop while he's studying to become a pastor. So that is what we'll deal with in the next letters, but that is going to take us into essentially the final phase before he becomes an artist. So it's basically, he was an art dealer, that's the first phase. The second phase is he becomes like a school teacher, not for very long. Then he's a pastor for quite long, and then he becomes an artist. So I think this phase we're going into now is very important, because I think he starts drawing more. He draws the figures in front of him. He describes the figures in front of him, but then he starts drawing them. That is what eventually gets him into the art frame. This period of preaching. It's the last step in his evolution to become the great artist that he became. I don't think of him as a great artist so much in terms of the works that he produced, although some of them are pretty amazing, but more the journey he took as a person, that he became a certain expressive person, able to express things in a way that had never been expressed before in terms of art, in kind of an abstract way, in a very expressive way. And so we're about to embark on the final leg of that journey, and it's a brutal leg. It's full of deprivation. It's full of, if Van Gogh could have chosen, he couldn't have chosen a setting of greater deprivation and suffering and hardship than the mines of the Borinage. So if you think that all of this is wishy-washy, he was about to put his money where his mouth was and go into this place of great austerity, great adversity by choice. And what's really interesting is where he goes from there. He comes out of this darkness, out of this coal dusted environment. And he doesn't quite realize it yet, but he comes out of that and he starts to try and move towards the light and to the color. He's trying to come out of darkness into vitality, into vibrance, into the world electrified. And he needs to go through this darkness in order to appreciate the light, and how he appreciates the light, right? Does that make sense? Does it make sense how his journey is evolving and why it's evolving in the way it's evolving? So he's right now is a work in progress, right? And he hasn't even really started painting. So we're almost at the 3-hour mark. Thank you to Nisi for that. Thanks very much for that. Thanks for is that dark glasses? And was it Corporal Deb? Thanks a lot for that from Australia. LVL. What's that? What does that mean? What is LVL? Laminated veneer lumber. What is LVL? Level up. Oh, okay, cool. Okay, thanks for that. Yeah, I'm sorry. I actually didn't know that we would get stuck for so long in Ramsgate. I thought we were going to move quite quickly through this, but yeah, I didn't realize there would be so many letters. So there you go. Corporal Deb says you're very welcome. Thank you. Thanks, Terry Dean. Thanks, Nisi. Yeah, it's a nice group of people. It's good to see so many people interested, and it's not nice to see almost every live I put up, I lose about 20 subscribers, but I think, my channel's also a work in progress. It's got to go where it needs to go. And I guess people have got to know who I am in order to decide that this is the channel for them. So that's also, what needs to happen. So Stephanie, let me know if we're going to do the CrimeCon thing tomorrow. If we do, then I'll do the Casey White thing on Friday, or I'll do it just as an episode. I would rather share just my impression of their relationship, why she did what she did, and also why. And I think you've got to think about Chris Watts, why Chris Watts acted in a bizarre and crazy way. I think a lot of the same substances, the same, I don't mean drugs though, the same substance in a Chris Watts case was addling the mind of this person, turned into a totally different person, but you still got to remember that anyone is susceptible to a fairy tale, especially when it's being in love with someone and getting a chance at love and all of that, right? But I want to be a lot more specific about that explanation. I want to be a lot more practical about what we're talking about. Oh, is it too late? Okay, that's fine. So I'll be doing KCY tomorrow. Paddy says that's fine. We enjoy every minute. Nisi says it really is an enjoyable time during my week. The fact that you guys appreciate it so much really makes it worth it for me. And I also quite enjoy it. And so I'm not really that fussed about subscribers that unsubscribe. I care about it, but I feel like I really want to do something that my best subscribers, my most loyal fans, and a lot of you are readers as well. I want to do something that we enjoy together, rather than trying to keep a whole bunch of anonymous subscribers that I don't know happy. So that's how I rationalize it. My channel went from 86,000, almost 800. It was around about at 800 to 86,400, almost bottoming out at 400. And then when I did a couple of Casey White videos, the subscribers sort of jumped up a bit, 50 odd or whatever. But putting a video like this out, people will come here, see me, be like, well, that's so boring, unsubscribe. And it might be about 20 people or so. So every time I put a video like this, I'll probably lose 20 to 30 subscribers. But that's a small percentage given the total. Having said that, I do care. It is a bit of a 2 steps forward, 1 step back scenario, and I don't like it, but it is what it is, and I do appreciate you guys, and I know you guys appreciate me, and that to me is what's important. So Terry says, I almost learned how to crochet tonight. I'll make TCRS beanies for all of us. That'll be awesome. That'll be good TCRS beanies when we yeah. By the way, this comes from France, comes from Chamonix in France. So it's come a long way as well. Gathering Places, YouTube unsubscribes people for inactive accounts. I'm not sure if that's what's been going on. It's I can see when I put up a video, it'll say plus so many or minus so many. So I don't think that's what's going on. Corporal Deb says your beanie suits you. I think so, but have you seen this? Have you seen this part of it? It's like actually got tassels on it. So if you walking out at night, you might be mistaken for a Rasta. Okay. Okay, so we've just gone over 3 hours, one of my longer lives. I can feel my voice is not doing so well. Stephanie, I did hear you. I will try and narrate chapter 18 of Treachery. So look out for that tomorrow. Okay. Stephanie says she's really enjoying Treachery, the 5-month search for Kaylee Anthony, and I must say I've enjoyed narrating, and I found it quite a well-written book. Like I've written a lot of books, and some books I'm like, okay, you could have done that better. This book I'm kind of like, wow, I actually wrote that quite well. I think Treachery 2 is one of my better written books, definitely. Stephanie says it is so good, and I appreciate that. Yeah, so guys, thanks a lot for joining me. As I say, I might do this book later this year, or some of it, maybe the first part of it, and then take you guys through some of the backstory that's involved there. If you guys haven't listened to Treachery, it's the 5-month search for Anthony, Kaylee Anthony, narrating it on Patreon, so look out for it there. I do think it's worth, it's a narrative that is worth paying attention to. Okay, guys, thanks very much to the only mod in the house, Stephanie. And also, we do miss Bria, but the timing is just not good for her. Starting at 3 o'clock in the morning is 3 o'clock in the morning in France. But hopefully we'll see Bria before not too long. All the members who are here, and also to those who are not members, consider becoming a member. It will certainly mean something to me in a time where I'm sort of losing a bit of subscribers, and it's always a nice thing to see, oh, I got another member kind of thing. So think about it, maybe be a member just for 1 month while we are doing this Van Gogh letters thing. I mean, the Van Gogh letters thing is only going to be probably one more month. It's not going to be forever. And then you can cancel your membership if you want to. Real Batman says, reserving judgments is a matter of infinite hope. Well said. Okay, guys, thanks a lot. Members, those who aren't members who are watching, thanks for being here. Thanks a lot for the contributions, super chats. Thanks very much for that. Take care, sleep well, and I'll see you guys next time. All the best. Ivy, are you hungry?